The Long Shadow, America's Hand in Other Nations, an extended historical sleep story. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're embarking on a long journey through more than a century of American foreign policy. From the shores of the Caribbean to the mountains of Central America, from the rice paddies of Southeast Asia to the deserts of the Middle East, from the jungles of the Philippines to the streets of Caracas in 2026, we'll trace the thread of intervention. We'll explore the pattern, the justifications, the consequences, and the human cost of empire. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. The foundation, the Monroe Doctrine and early American expansion. In the beginning, there was a doctrine, not carved in stone by ancient prophets, but proclaimed in a speech by President James Monroe in 1823. It was December, cold in Washington, the sort of winter day when breath hangs in the air and fires are stoked high against the chill. Monroe stood before Congress to deliver what would become one of the most consequential statements in American diplomatic history. His message was simple, at least on its surface. The Americas, he declared, were no longer open to European colonization. Any attempt by European powers to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. The context mattered. Across Latin America, nations were breaking free from Spanish and Portuguese rule. Simón Bolívar was liberating northern South America. José de San Martín was leading independence movements in Argentina and Chile. Mexico had thrown off Spanish control. Brazil would soon separate from Portugal. Monroe's declaration was, in part, a recognition of this new reality, a statement that the age of European colonialism in the Americas was over. But it was also something more. It was an assertion of American influence, a claim that the United States, though small and relatively weak, had a special role in the hemisphere. The Old World and the New World were to remain separate, distinct. European powers should tend to their own affairs, and the Americas would manage theirs. At the time, most European leaders dismissed the statement with amusement or irritation. The United States was young, barely 50 years old, still finding its footing on the world stage. Its navy was modest, its army small. What authority did this upstart republic have to speak for an entire hemisphere? The British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, scoffed that Britain's naval power, not American pronouncements, would keep Europe out of the Americas. But Monroe's words were not meant for that moment. They were seeds planted for a future that only a few could imagine. As the decades passed, as America grew stronger, more industrial, more confident, those words would be remembered. They would be reinterpreted. They would be stretched and molded to fit new circumstances, new ambitions, new fears. The 19th century saw America's westward expansion, the annexation of Texas, the war with Mexico that seized half of Mexico's territory, the acquisition of California, Arizona, New Mexico. This was manifest destiny, the belief that American expansion across the continent was divinely ordained, inevitable, a fulfillment of the nation's special role. The indigenous peoples who stood in the way were removed, often violently, their lands taken, their cultures decimated. By the 1890s, America had reached its continental limits. The frontier was closed, as historians declared. But the impulse to expand did not vanish. It simply looked outward, beyond the shores, to new territories, new markets, new spheres of influence. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked this transition. In a conflict that lasted barely 4 months, the United States defeated Spain, seized control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. America had become an imperial power, joining the European nations it had once criticized for their colonialism. But American imperialism wore a different mask. It spoke not of colonies, but of protection, not of conquest, but of civilization, not of extraction, but of development. The rhetoric was different, but the reality was often the same. Local populations found themselves under foreign control, their resources exploited, their political autonomy constrained. By the time Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901, the Monroe Doctrine had evolved considerably. Roosevelt, a man of boundless energy and imperial vision, of thick mustaches and vigorous pronouncements, added what came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary. The United States, he declared, had not merely the right but the duty to intervene in Latin American nations if they engaged in chronic wrongdoing or if they could not maintain order and fiscal responsibility. It was paternalism dressed in the language of civilization. It was empire building called by another name. Roosevelt spoke of the big stick, borrowed from an African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." But in Latin America, there was little softness. There was the stick, heavy and uncompromising, backed by Marines in pressed uniforms, by gunboats with gleaming cannons, by economic pressure that could strangle a nation's economy in months. American customs officials took over the finances of Caribbean nations. American military governors ruled territories directly. American companies, with Washington's backing, acquired vast holdings in land, railroads, mines, plantations. This was the foundation. This was the bedrock upon which a century of interventions would be built. And in January 2026, when President Donald Trump stood before reporters at Mar-a-Lago with its gilded decor and manicured lawns and spoke of the Monroe Doctrine, he was not inventing something new. He was reaching back, consciously or not, to a tradition as old as American power itself, a tradition of asserting dominance in the Western Hemisphere, of treating the nations to the South not as equals, but as subordinates, as wards requiring guidance or as threats requiring control. The pattern begins. The banana republics and early occupations. The early 20th century saw the birth of a term that would become shorthand for American commercial imperialism, the banana republic. It was not a compliment. It referred to the small nations of Central America and the Caribbean that had become, in effect, economic colonies of American fruit companies, most notably the United Fruit Company. The writer O. Henry coined the term in 1904, drawing from his observations in Honduras, where he had fled to escape embezzlement charges. His fictional Anchuria was based on places where American companies wielded more power than local governments. These were not traditional colonies in the European sense. There were no governors sent from Washington wearing plumed hats, no direct annexation of territory marked on maps with new borders. But the control was real nonetheless. American companies owned vast plantations stretching from coast to coast. They controlled railroads that moved their products to port. They owned the ports themselves, the docks where ships loaded bananas destined for American markets. They built company towns where workers lived in company housing, shopped at company stores, and found that their wages often returned to the very company that paid them. The United Fruit Company, in particular, became synonymous with this system. At its height, It was the largest employer in Central America, owning more than 3 million acres of land. It controlled the railroads in Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica. It operated steamship lines. Its political influence reached into the highest levels of American government. When it spoke, Washington listened. And when local governments threatened those interests, when they tried to regulate or tax or redistribute land, when nationalist movements sought to reclaim sovereignty over their own resources, the consequences were swift. Diplomatic pressure would be applied first. American ambassadors would express concern. Economic levers would be pulled, loans denied, trade disrupted. But if these measures failed, there was always the ultimate recourse: military intervention. The United States Marines became, in these years, the enforcement arm of corporate interest. They were young men, mostly, farm boys and city kids who had enlisted for adventure or steady pay. They found themselves landing on tropical shores, marching through jungles, occupying cities where they did not speak the language, did not understand the culture, but were told they were bringing order, stability, civilization to backward lands. Nicaragua became the most enduring example. The Marines landed there in 1912, ostensibly to protect American lives and property during a period of civil unrest. But they stayed, with brief interruptions, until 1933. 21 years of occupation, justified by the need for stability, by fears of European interference, particularly from Britain and Germany, by the protection of American lives and property. American officials took control of Nicaragua's customs houses, its railways, its national bank. Nicaragua's government became, in effect, a client of Washington, dependent on American approval for its survival. The occupation was not without resistance. Augusto Cesar Sandino, a nationalist guerrilla leader, fought the Marines and the US-backed Nicaraguan National Guard for years. He became a symbol of resistance to American imperialism, a hero to many Nicaraguans and across Latin America. The Marines never defeated him militarily. When they finally withdrew in 1933, leaving behind a National Guard trained and equipped by the United States, Sandino agreed to peace talks. Shortly after, he was assassinated by the Guard on orders from its commander, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, who would go on to establish a family dictatorship that lasted until 1979. But beneath those justifications lay something simpler, something more direct: control. Control over a region that Washington had decided fell within its natural sphere of influence. Control over economies that could be opened to American investment. Control over governments that would be friendly to American interests. It was not always dressed up in ideological language. Sometimes it was remarkably candid. As Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler, who had led interventions across the region, would later write with bitter clarity, "I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. I was a racketeer for capitalism." In Honduras, American forces landed 5 times between 1903 and 1925. Each time, the stated reason was to protect American lives during periods of political instability. Each time, the effect was to ensure that governments friendly to United Fruit remained in power. Honduras became the archetypal banana republic, its economy utterly dependent on banana exports, its politics dominated by the fruit companies' interests. In Haiti, the Marines arrived in 1915 and stayed until 1934. The occupation was triggered by political instability and concerns about European influence, particularly from Germany. But it quickly became something more extensive. American officials rewrote Haiti's constitution to allow foreign ownership of land, something that had been prohibited since Haiti's independence. They imposed forced labor to build roads. They established a new military force, the gendarmerie, trained by Marines and used to suppress resistance. Thousands of Haitians died in rebellions against the occupation. The most serious uprising, the Crackle revolt led by Charlemagne Péralte, was brutally suppressed. Péralte was killed in 1919, and his body was photographed crucifixion style on a door, an image designed to intimidate other would-be resistors. In the Dominican Republic, the pattern repeated. The Marines occupied the country from 1916 to 1924, taking over its government, its customs services, its military. They built roads, improved sanitation, established order of a kind. But they also censored the press, disbanded political parties, and crushed dissent. When they left behind a constabulary that would produce Rafael Trujillo, one of the 20th century's most brutal dictators who would rule the Dominican Republic with an iron fist until his assassination in 1961. These early interventions were overt, unapologetic. There was little pretense of ideological justification beyond vague invocations of civilization and progress. They were about money, about markets, about securing the commercial interests of American corporations in a region that Washington had decided fell within its natural sphere of influence. The occupations were reported in American newspapers, debated in Congress, defended by presidents as necessary for order and stability. But after World War II, the justification would change. The banana would be replaced by a new specter, more frightening, more all-encompassing, more capable of mobilizing public support for intervention. The specter of communism. The Cold War framework. From economic control to ideological crusade. The end of World War II transformed the global landscape. Europe lay in ruins, its empires crumbling. The Soviet Union had emerged as a superpower, its armies occupying Eastern Europe, its ideology spreading to China, Korea, Southeast Asia. The United States, its homeland untouched by the devastation, its economy booming, faced a choice. It could retreat into isolation, as it had after World War I. Or it could embrace a new role as leader of the free world, guarantor of security, bulwark against communist expansion. It chose the latter. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, committed the United States to support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures, code for communist movements. The Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe, ensuring those nations would remain in the Western camp. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization created a military alliance to contain Soviet power. But containment was not limited to Europe. The logic extended globally. Anywhere communism threatened to gain a foothold, American interests were at stake. This was not merely about ideology, though ideology mattered. It was about maintaining a world order favorable to American security and prosperity. Communist nations tended to be closed to American trade and investment. They aligned with the Soviet Union, expanding its sphere of influence. They inspired revolutionary movements elsewhere, threatening the stability that American policy sought to maintain. In Asia, this led to major wars in Korea and Vietnam, conflicts we will explore in detail shortly. But in Latin America, where direct Soviet military presence was minimal, containment took different forms. It meant supporting any government, no matter how repressive, that declared itself anti-communist. It meant opposing any movement, no matter how democratic, that seemed even potentially sympathetic to communist ideas. And it meant using the full range of American power, diplomatic, economic, covert, and, when necessary, military, to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remained firmly in the American camp. The Central Intelligence Agency, created in 1947, became the primary instrument of this policy. The CIA could do things that the military could not, operating in secret, with plausible deniability, free from the constraints that governed overt military action. It could fund political parties, manipulate elections, spread propaganda, support coups, train insurgents, assassinate leaders. All beneath the surface, all without congressional approval or public knowledge, all justified by the exigencies of the Cold War. The National Security Council document NSC 68, drafted in 1950, laid out the stark logic of this approach. The Soviet Union, it argued, was committed to global domination. Any expansion of communist power anywhere in the world threatened American security. Therefore, the United States must meet that threat wherever it appeared, with whatever means necessary. The document called for a massive military buildup, for covert operations, for psychological warfare, for economic pressure. It was a blueprint for permanent global engagement, for a national security state geared toward perpetual conflict. This framework transformed how interventions were justified and conducted. No longer were they simply about protecting American business interests, though that remained important. Now they were about defending freedom, stopping totalitarianism, preventing the spread of an ideology that threatened everything America stood for. The rhetoric was powerful, the stakes presented as existential, and it provided cover for actions that might otherwise have been difficult to justify to the American public. The impact on Latin America was profound. Nationalist leaders who sought to chart independent courses, who wanted to redistribute land, nationalize industries, pursue neutral foreign policies, all could be labeled as communists or communist sympathizers. The label, once applied, triggered a predictable response. American support would be withdrawn. Economic pressure would be applied. Covert operations would be launched. And if necessary, military intervention would follow. The Cold War did not create American intervention in Latin America, but it supercharged it. It provided an ideological justification that resonated more powerfully than mere commercial interest. It mobilized resources on a scale previously unimaginable, and it created a sense of urgency that overrode concerns about sovereignty, democracy, or human rights. In the struggle against communism, the ends justified the means, or so the logic went. Guatemala, 1954. The template for covert regime change. On June 27, 1954, a coup was executed in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz, the country's second democratically elected leader, was overthrown by a military force backed, trained, and directed by the Central Intelligence Agency. The operation was codenamed PB Success, a label dripping with dark irony, for the success would haunt Guatemala for decades to come, leaving a legacy of violence, dictatorship, and civil war that would claim 200,000 lives over the next 40 years. Arbenz's crime, in the eyes of Washington, was land reform. But to understand the coup, we must understand Guatemala's history. For centuries, a tiny elite had controlled the vast majority of the country's arable land. 2% of the population owned 70% of the land. The indigenous Maya majority lived in crushing poverty, working as laborers on plantations, denied education, denied political rights, denied the most basic opportunities for advancement. This changed briefly in 1944 when a popular uprising overthrew the military dictator Jorge Ubico. A democratic election brought Juan José Arévalo to power, a philosophy professor who implemented moderate reforms: labor rights, social security, universal suffrage. His successor, Jacobo Arbenz, elected in 1951, went further. He proposed agrarian reform, the redistribution of unused land to landless peasants. The United Fruit Company controlled vast tracts of territory in Guatemala, more than 500,000 acres. But much of it lay fallow, held as reserve for future use or as protection against diseases that might strike cultivated areas. Arbenz's law would expropriate this unused land, compensate the owners based on the value they themselves had declared for tax purposes, and redistribute it to peasants who would finally have the chance to feed their families, to build something of their own. It was agrarian reform, not particularly radical by the standards of the time. Similar programs had been implemented in Japan after World War II, in South Korea, in Taiwan, all supported by the very same United States that now saw Arbenz as a mortal threat. The Mexican Revolution had implemented land reform decades earlier. Even the United States itself had given away vast tracts of land to settlers through the Homestead Acts. Land redistribution was hardly a communist innovation. But in Guatemala, the stakes were different, the interests more immediate. The United Fruit Company stood to lose hundreds of thousands of acres, and the company was not without influence in Washington. The connections ran deep, a web of personal and financial interests intertwined with national security policy. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, a prestigious New York law firm that represented United Fruit. His brother, Allen Dulles, director of the CIA and architect of the Guatemala operation, had served on the company's board of directors. President Eisenhower's personal secretary, Ann Whitman, was married to United Fruit's public relations director, Edmund Whitman. Undersecretary of State Bedell Smith would join United Fruit's board after leaving government. Henry Cabot Lodge, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who would defend the coup there, owned stock in the company. These connections mattered. They created a situation where corporate interests and government policy were nearly indistinguishable, where what was good for United Fruit was assumed to be good for America. But the justification presented to Eisenhower, to Congress, to the public, was not about bananas or corporate profits. It was about communism. Arbenz, they argued, was a communist, or at least a communist sympathizer. His government included communists in minor positions. He had legalized the Guatemalan Communist Party. He maintained friendly relations with the Soviet Union. He was opening the door to communist influence in the Western Hemisphere, establishing a beachhead from which Soviet power could expand, threatening the Panama Canal, threatening Mexico, ultimately threatening the United States itself. The evidence for this was thin. Arbenz was a nationalist, a reformer, but not a communist. He was democratically elected, enjoyed widespread popular support, and was implementing policies well within the bounds of democratic governance. The Soviet Union had shown little interest in Guatemala. No Soviet arms, no Soviet advisors, no Soviet money had arrived. But in the atmosphere of the early 1950s, with McCarthyism at its height, with the Korean War fresh in memory, with communism seen as an existential threat, the accusations were enough. The CIA launched Operation PB Success in 1954. It was a comprehensive campaign of psychological warfare and covert action. Radio broadcasts, supposedly from rebel stations inside Guatemala, spread rumors and fear. Pamphlets dropped from planes warned of impending invasion. A small force of mercenaries, no more than 400 men, many of them Guatemalan exiles, was trained in Honduras and Nicaragua. Their leader was Carlos Castillo Armas, a former Guatemalan military officer who had attempted a failed coup in 1950 and had been recruited by the CIA. The mercenary army crossed the border from Honduras on June 18, 1954. They were poorly equipped, poorly trained, and vastly outnumbered by the Guatemalan military. In a straight fight, they would have been crushed. But the operation was not about military victory. It was about psychological pressure, about creating the illusion of a larger force, about convincing Arbenz that American intervention was imminent and unstoppable. CIA planes, flown by American pilots, bombed Guatemala City and other targets. The bombs killed civilians but did little military damage. That was not their purpose. Their purpose was terror, intimidation, the message that resistance was futile. American radio broadcasts encouraged the Guatemalan military to abandon Arbenz. American diplomats made it clear that if Arbenz did not step down, the full force of American power would be brought to bear. The operation was a bluff, but it worked. Arbenz's military commanders, seeing American planes overhead, hearing reports of an invasion force, fearing that the United States would intervene directly if they resisted, refused to fight. They pressured Arbenz to resign. On June 27th, a broken man, Arbenz gave a final radio address. He defended his policies, condemned the intervention, and stepped down. He sought asylum in the Mexican embassy and eventually left for Cuba, where he would die in 1971. Never having returned to his homeland, his dreams of reform shattered. Castillo Armas was installed as president. He was flown to Guatemala City on an American embassy plane. His first acts were to reverse Arbenz's reforms, to return expropriated land to United Fruit, to ban political parties, to imprison and execute suspected communists. The military that took power would hold it, in one form or another, for the next 40 years. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in Latin American history. A civil war erupted in 1960 as leftist guerrillas, seeing no path to change through democratic means, took up arms. The military responded with a counterinsurgency campaign of extraordinary brutality. Villages suspected of supporting the guerrillas were destroyed, their inhabitants massacred. The military especially targeted the Mayan indigenous population, seeing them as inherently subversive. Entire communities were wiped out. The phrase "scorched earth" became literal. Crops burned, homes destroyed, people killed or driven into the mountains. American support for the Guatemalan military continued throughout this period. Military aid, training, intelligence support flowed from Washington. The U.S. Army School of the Americas, based in Panama and later Fort Benning, Georgia, trained Guatemalan officers in counterinsurgency techniques. These techniques included torture, assassination, forced disappearances, the tools of state terror. By the time the Civil War ended in 1996, 200,000 people were dead, most of them indigenous Guatemalans killed by government forces. A truth commission established after the war concluded that the military had committed acts of genocide, that American training and support had been instrumental in the violence, that the coup of 1954 had set in motion a chain of events that devastated the country for generations. But in 1954, in Washington, the operation was celebrated as a triumph. A communist government had been removed with minimal American casualties, minimal cost, and minimal public awareness. The CIA had demonstrated its effectiveness. A template had been established, a model for how to remove unfriendly governments without the mess and expense of direct military intervention. The lesson learned was not lost on CIA operatives or on Latin American leaders. The message was clear. There were limits to sovereignty, to democracy, to self-determination. Cross those limits, threaten American interests, and the consequences would be severe. Elections could be subverted, governments could be overthrown, and the hand behind it all might never be visible to the public eye. The coup in Guatemala became the blueprint for future operations. In Iran the year before, in Cuba, in Chile, in Nicaragua, across the developing world. Covert action had proven its worth, and it would be used again and again. Cuba and the Bay of Pigs, a public failure of intervention. Not every intervention succeeded. Some became cautionary tales, embarrassments that haunted their architects for the rest of their lives, spectacular failures that exposed the limits of American power and the dangers of hubris. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was one such failure, public in a way that the covert operations of the 1950s had not been, a humiliation that nearly derailed a new presidency and pushed the world closer to nuclear war. Fidel Castro had seized power in Cuba on New Year's Day, 1959, overthrowing the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista after years of guerrilla warfare in the mountains. At first, the United States was uncertain how to respond. Castro was not initially aligned with the Soviet Union. His revolution was nationalist, populist, driven more by anti-Batista sentiment and a desire to break the stranglehold of foreign corporations over Cuba's economy than by communist ideology. His movement included Democrats, socialists, communists, even some conservatives who simply opposed Batista's corruption. Castro himself was an enigma. He came from a wealthy family, had trained as a lawyer, had participated in democratic politics before concluding that Batista's dictatorship made reform impossible. His speeches were rambling, hours-long affairs, full of passion and vague promises. He spoke of justice, of land reform, of breaking the power of the oligarchy. But whether he was a communist was unclear, even to many who knew him. American policy pushed him in that direction. The United States had long supported Batista, seeing him as a reliable anti-communist despite his brutality and corruption. When Castro overthrew him, Washington was skeptical and hostile. As Castro moved to nationalize American-owned sugar plantations, oil refineries, utilities, assets worth billions of dollars, American attitudes hardened further. Economic sanctions were imposed. The CIA began plotting Castro's removal almost immediately. Castro, facing American hostility, turned to the Soviet Union for support. The Soviets, seeing an opportunity to gain an ally 90 miles from American shores, provided arms, oil, trade agreements. By 1960, Cuba was firmly in the Soviet orbit, not because Castro had been a communist all along, but because American pressure had left him with nowhere else to turn. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, a classic Cold War dynamic where American fear of communist expansion helped create the very outcome it sought to prevent. The plan that emerged from the CIA was audacious and deeply flawed. A force of Cuban exiles would be trained, equipped, and landed on the southern coast of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The landing would spark a popular uprising against Castro. The Cuban people, the planners assumed, were waiting for just such an opportunity to overthrow the communist regime. The military would defect, the government would collapse, and Castro would flee or be killed. American involvement would be minimal and deniable. The world would see a successful indigenous revolution, not an American-sponsored invasion. Every assumption was wrong. President John F. Kennedy, newly inaugurated at age 43, inexperienced in foreign policy, inherited the plan for the Eisenhower administration. He was skeptical, but felt pressured to act. The CIA assured him of success. His military advisors, though privately doubtful, did not voice strong opposition. The Cuban exiles, trained in Guatemala and Nicaragua, were eager to reclaim their homeland. And the political cost of canceling the operation, of appearing weak on communism, seemed too high. Kennedy gave his approval, but with one critical modification. There would be no direct U.S. military support. The operation had to be plausibly deniable. It had to appear as a purely Cuban affair, an internal rebellion rather than an American invasion. This decision, made for political reasons, doomed the operation from the start. On April 17, 1961, Brigade 2506, consisting of about 1,400 Cuban exiles, landed at the Bay of Pigs. The landing site had been chosen poorly. It was swampy, isolated, far from mountains where the invaders could have retreated to wage guerrilla warfare if the initial landing failed. The element of surprise was lost. Castro had been warned by Cuban intelligence, which had penetrated exile groups in Miami. His forces were ready. Within hours, the invasion was in trouble. The expected uprising never materialized. The Cuban people did not rise up. They stayed in their homes, or they watched, or they supported Castro's forces. The Cuban military did not defect. They fought, and they fought well. Castro personally directed the defense, moving to the front lines, rallying his troops. The invaders radioed desperately for air support. Kennedy, watching the operation unravel from the White House, faced the decision of whether to commit American forces to save the invasion. It would mean dropping the pretense of deniability, admitting American involvement, risking a larger war. He refused. Some airstrikes were authorized, flown by Cuban exile pilots in American-supplied planes, but they were too little, too late. Most of the planes were shot down. Within 3 days, the invasion was crushed. More than 100 invaders were killed. Nearly 1,200 were captured and later ransomed back to the United States in exchange for food and medicine. Only a handful escaped. The failure was complete, the humiliation total. Castro's regime was strengthened, not weakened. He used the invasion to consolidate power, to round up suspected opponents, to rally nationalist sentiment. The Soviet Union, seeing an ally under threat, deepened its commitment to Cuba. Within a year and a half, Soviet missiles would be installed on the island, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. For Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs was a searing lesson in the limits of covert action and the dangers of deferring to intelligence agencies and military advisors. He reportedly said afterward that he should have listened to his own instincts, that he had been misled by the CIA's confidence and the pressure to appear tough on communism. He fired Allen Dulles, the CIA director who had overseen the operation. He reorganized his national security apparatus to give himself more direct control. But even in failure, the Bay of Pigs did not end American efforts to remove Castro. For the next 50 years, for the remainder of the Cold War and beyond, the United States would maintain a comprehensive embargo on Cuba, isolate it diplomatically, fund dissident groups, attempt multiple assassination plots against Castro himself. The CIA's Operation Mongoose in the early 1960s included schemes involving exploding cigars, poisoned diving suits, even enlisting mafia figures to kill the Cuban leader. None succeeded, but they became the stuff of legend, symbols of an obsession that outlasted its strategic rationale. Cuba remained a thorn in American side, a symbol of the limits of American power, a reminder that even a small nation could defy the superpower if it was willing to pay the price, and if it had a determined leader and external support. Castro himself became a global icon of anti-imperialism, surviving for decades, outlasting 10 American presidents, dying in his bed at age 90 in 2016, never having been overthrown, never having wavered in his defiance of the United States. The obsession with Castro's removal became a defining feature of US policy in the hemisphere, long after the strategic rationale had faded, long after the Soviet Union had collapsed, long after Cuba ceased to pose any real threat to American security. It was partly about wounded pride, about the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs. It was partly about domestic politics, about the influence of Cuban exiles in Florida, a crucial swing state in American elections. And it was partly about precedent, about the fear that if Cuba could get away with defying the United States, others might try as well. The obsession shaped American policy toward the entire region, making any hint of socialist or nationalist reform in Latin America suspect, triggering fears of another Cuba that would be used to justify interventions for decades to come. The Dominican Republic, 1965. Better a Trujillo than a Castro. 4 years after the Bay of Pigs, the United States would intervene in the Dominican Republic, this time with direct military force, tens of thousands of troops, in an operation that laid bare the priorities of American policy in the region. The intervention was justified by fears of communism, by the specter of another Cuba. But what it really demonstrated was that the United States would not tolerate even democratic, moderate reformers if they threatened American interests or opened the door, however slightly, to leftist influence. The Dominican Republic had suffered under one of the hemisphere's most brutal dictatorships. Rafael Trujillo had ruled from 1930 to 1961, 31 years of tyranny, corruption, and violence. His secret police, the SIM, tortured and murdered opponents. His family controlled vast swaths of the economy. He renamed the capital city Ciudad Trujillo after himself. His personality cult was pervasive, oppressive, grotesque. Yet the United States supported him throughout because he was reliably anti-communist, because he allowed American businesses to operate freely, because he provided stability of a kind. When Trujillo was assassinated in 1961 with CYA backing, the United States hoped for a smooth transition to a more moderate, more democratic, but still reliably pro-American government. Instead, elections in 1962 brought Juan Bosch to power, a leftist intellectual, a novelist who had spent years in exile. Bosch was not a communist. He was a social democrat, committed to reform, to addressing the crushing poverty, to breaking the power of the oligarchy and the military. But to the Dominican military, to the country's elite, to American officials, he was dangerous. Bosch lasted only 7 months before the military overthrew him in September 1963. The United States did not intervene to protect him. It acquiesced in the coup, preferring military rule to the uncertainty of Bosch's reforms. The junta that took power was corrupt, repressive, and increasingly unpopular. By April 1965, younger military officers and civilian supporters of Bosch launched a counter-coup, a constitutionalist movement aimed at restoring democratic government. President Lyndon Johnson, watching the situation unfold, feared another Cuba. His advisors warned that communists were involved in the constitutionalist movement, that if Bosch returned to power, the Dominican Republic could become a Soviet ally. The evidence was thin, the claims exaggerated. But Johnson, scarred by Republican attacks that Democrats were soft on communism, convinced that he could not afford another communist takeover in the hemisphere, decided to act. On April 28, 1965, just days after the constitutionalist uprising began, Johnson ordered American troops into the Dominican Republic. Within a week, more than 22,000 Marines and paratroopers had landed. It was the largest American military intervention in Latin America since the occupations of the 1920s and 1930s. The stated justification was to protect American lives, to evacuate American citizens. But the real purpose was to prevent the constitutionalists from winning, to ensure that the Dominican Republic did not move left. The intervention worked in the narrow sense. The constitutionalists, lacking heavy weapons, unable to match American firepower, were contained. A political settlement was imposed. Elections were held in 1966, carefully managed to ensure that Bosch did not win. Joaquin Balaguer, a former Trujillo loyalist, a conservative, was elected with American support. He would dominate Dominican politics for the next 30 years, presiding over a system characterized by corruption, vote fraud, and political violence. The intervention was controversial even at the time. Critics in the United States and across Latin America condemned it as a violation of the principle of non-intervention, as proof that American commitments to democracy were hollow. Senator J. William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, held hearings that exposed the administration's deceptions, its exaggerations of the communist threat. But Johnson defended the intervention, and it stood. Better a right-wing dictatorship in this view than the risk of a leftist government. As Thomas Mann, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, reportedly said, echoing a phrase attributed to FDR about an earlier dictator, "Better a Trujillo than a Castro." The Dominican intervention demonstrated a pattern that would repeat itself across the Cold War. The United States supported democracy in rhetoric, but opposed it in practice when democratic movements threatened American interests or opened space for leftist influence. Elections were acceptable if they produced the right results. Sovereignty was respected when it aligned with American policy. But when push came to shove, when a choice had to be made between democratic principles and anti-communist priorities, the latter always won. Chile, 1973. The death of democracy. If Guatemala in 1954 was the template for covert regime change, Chile in 1973 was its most tragic and consequential application. The coup that overthrew Salvador Allende and brought Augusto Pinochet to power was not a direct American invasion. There were no Marines landing on Chilean shores, no American tanks rolling through Santiago's streets. But American involvement was deep, sustained, deliberate, and ultimately decisive in creating the conditions for Allende's fall and for the brutal dictatorship that followed. Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile in September 1970. The election was free, fair, and closely watched by observers from across the hemisphere. Allende won a plurality, not a majority, but under Chile's constitution, the Congress would choose between the top two candidates, and it chose Allende. He was inaugurated in November 1970, the first Marxist to be democratically elected president anywhere in the world. His victory was seen as proof that socialism could come through the ballot box, that revolution did not require violence, that democratic institutions could be used to transform society. Allende was a physician, a longtime senator, a founder of Chile's Socialist Party. He had run for president 3 times before, each time coming closer. His coalition, Popular Unity, included socialists, communists, radicals, and dissident Christian Democrats. His platform was ambitious, nationalizing Chile's copper industry, which was largely controlled by American companies like Anaconda and Kennecott, implementing agrarian reform, expanding social services, redistributing wealth from the oligarchy to workers and peasants. This was democratic socialism, implemented within the framework of Chile's long-standing constitutional order. Chile had one of Latin America's strongest democratic traditions, nearly 40 years of uninterrupted civilian rule, robust institutions, a free press, competitive elections. Allende was committed to respecting these traditions, to using legal, peaceful means to achieve his goals. He called his project the Chilean Road to Socialism. But in Washington, Allende's election was seen as a disaster, a strategic defeat, an unacceptable threat. President Richard Nixon, upon hearing the news, was blunt. "That son of a bitch," he reportedly said, "that son of a bitch is not going to be in office long if I have anything to do with it." In a meeting with CIA Director Richard Helms and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, Nixon ordered the CIA to do everything possible to prevent Allende from taking office, and if that failed, to ensure his government collapsed. "Make the economy scream," Nixon told Helms. It became the guiding principle of American policy toward Chile for the next 3 years. The CIA would use every tool at its disposal to destabilize Chile, to create chaos, to make Allende's presidency a failure, to demonstrate that socialism, even democratic socialism, could not work, that any government that challenged American interests would be destroyed. The campaign began even before Allende took office. The CIA funneled money to right-wing parties, to opposition newspapers, to anyone who would work against Allende. It explored plans for a military coup to prevent his inauguration. When General René Schneider, the commander of the Chilean army and a strict constitutionalist who opposed military intervention in politics, stood in the way, the CIA supported a plot to kidnap him. The plot went wrong. Schneider was shot and killed. The assassination backfired, strengthening support for constitutional order, and Allende was inaugurated as planned. But the pressure did not stop. For the next 3 years, the United States waged economic war on Chile. International loans were blocked. The World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank, heavily influenced by the United States, cut off funding. private banks, with American encouragement, refused credit. The price of copper, Chile's main export, was manipulated downward on international markets. Spare parts for American-made machinery became impossible to obtain, crippling Chilean industry. Food imports were restricted, contributing to shortages. At the same time, the CIA funded Chile's opposition. Millions of dollars flowed to right-wing parties, to the newspaper El Mercurio, which published a relentless stream of anti-Allende propaganda. Strikes were fomented and financed. In October 1972, a strike by truck owners, secretly funded by the CIA, paralyzed the economy. Middle-class Chileans, seeing empty shelves, rising prices, growing chaos, turned against Allende. The Chilean economy, fragile to begin with, buckled under the twin pressures of internal mismanagement and external sabotage. Inflation spiraled out of control. Black markets flourished. Political polarization intensified. The right accused Allende of destroying the country, of leading Chile toward communist dictatorship. The left accused the right and the United States of sabotage, of refusing to give democratic socialism a fair chance. Violence increased on both sides. Paramilitaries on the right and revolutionary groups on the left engaged in bombings, assassinations, street battles. Allende tried to navigate the crisis, to find a middle path, to maintain democratic norms even as the country was tearing apart. He brought military officers into his cabinet, hoping their presence would reassure the opposition, would demonstrate his commitment to constitutional order. But the military, traditionally apolitical in Chile, was being courted by the opposition, by the CYA, by those who believed that only a coup could save Chile from chaos and communism. On September 11th, 1973, the coup came. It was led by General Augusto Pinochet, whom Allende had appointed army commander just weeks earlier, believing him to be loyal to the Constitution. Pinochet betrayed that trust. With the support of the Navy, Air Force, and National Police, he launched a coordinated assault on the government. Tanks surrounded La Moneda, the presidential palace in the heart of Santiago. Fighter jets screamed overhead. Allende, in the palace with a few dozen loyal guards and supporters, was given an ultimatum: surrender or die. He refused to leave. He armed himself with an AK-47, a gift from Fidel Castro. He put on a helmet. In a final radio address, broadcast as the coup unfolded, he spoke to the Chilean people. "I will not resign," he said. "Placed in a historic transition, I will pay for the loyalty of the people with my life. I say to them that I am certain that the seed which we have planted in the good conscience of thousands and thousands of Chileans will not be shriveled forever. They have strength and will be able to dominate us, but social processes can be arrested neither by crime nor force. History is ours, and people make history." Shortly after, La Moneda was bombed by Air Force jets. The palace was stormed. Allende died either by suicide or killed by soldiers. The truth has never been definitively established. His body was secretly buried, later exhumed, examined, confirmed as death by suicide. But the circumstances remain disputed. The symbolism profound. What followed was 17 years of dictatorship, 17 years that transformed Chile and provided a chilling template for military regimes across Latin America. Pinochet's regime was brutal beyond measure. In the first days and weeks, thousands were arrested. Many were taken to the National Stadium, where they were interrogated, tortured, and in many cases executed. The bodies were dumped in rivers. buried in mass graves, dropped from helicopters into the ocean. The numbers are staggering. At least 3,000 people were killed or disappeared, a euphemism that became chillingly common in Latin America during these years. More than 30,000 were tortured, many of them in secret detention centers where torturers used electric shock, waterboarding, sexual violence, and psychological torment. Over 100,000 people went into exile, fleeing to Mexico, to France, to Sweden, to anywhere that would take them. Political parties were banned. The Congress was dissolved. The courts were intimidated into compliance. Universities were purged. Books were burned. The press was censored. Dissent was met with violence, swift and merciless. And through much of this, the United States supported Pinochet. He was an anti-communist, a reliable ally in the Cold War. His economic policies, dictated by a group of Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago, the so-called Chicago Boys, opened the country to foreign investment and aligned with American free market ideology. State-owned enterprises were privatized. Regulations were slashed. The economy was restructured according to neoliberal principles. Chile became a laboratory for economic shock therapy, a test case for the policies that would later be implemented across Latin America and the former Soviet Union. Henry Kissinger, who had helped orchestrate Allende's downfall, met with Pinochet in Santiago in 1976 and assured him of continued American support. In the United States, as you know, we are sympathetic with what you are trying to do here, Kissinger said. He warned Pinochet that there was pressure from Congress about human rights, but advised him to complete the dirty work before Congress reconvened. The message was clear: do what you need to do quickly, and we will protect you. Only in the late 1970s, as details of the regime's human rights abuses became impossible to ignore, as the murder of Orlando Letelier, a former Allende minister, in a car bombing in Washington, D.C., brought Pinochet's terror to American soil, did American support begin to waver. The Carter administration, elected in 1976 on a platform that emphasized human rights, cut some military aid, spoke out against the dictatorship. But the support never fully ended. Pinochet remained in power until 1990, leaving behind a Chile transformed, scarred, and deeply divided. The Chilean coup demonstrated several enduring truths about American foreign policy in Latin America during the Cold War. First, that the United States did not merely oppose communism. It opposed any government, even a democratically elected one, that challenged American economic interests or sought a path independent of Washington's control. Democracy, it turned out, was negotiable. Anti-communism was not. Second, that American policymakers were willing to use any means necessary to achieve their objectives. Economic sabotage, propaganda, support for coups, complicity in human rights abuses, all were justified by the imperatives of the Cold War, by the belief that the ends justified the means. Third, that the consequences of these interventions were borne almost entirely by the people of the countries targeted. Chileans paid the price for American fears, for American interests, for American Cold War strategy. They suffered the torture, the disappearances, the exile. They lived with the trauma for generations. And the United States, having helped create the conditions for Pinochet's dictatorship, bore little of the cost and less of the responsibility. Operation Condor. state terror as regional policy. Chile under Pinochet did not stand alone. Across South America in the 1970s and early 1980s, military dictatorships came to power in country after country. In Uruguay in 1973, in Argentina in 1976, in Brazil in 1964, in Paraguay throughout, in Bolivia repeatedly. These were not isolated events, but part of a regional wave, a coordinated effort to suppress the left, to crush labor movements, student activists, priests influenced by liberation theology, journalists, intellectuals, anyone who questioned military rule or advocated for social change. The most sinister aspect of this wave was Operation Condor, a secret intelligence sharing and assassination program that linked the military regimes of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. Created in 1975 with coordination and encouragement from the United States, Condor allowed these dictatorships to hunt their opponents across borders, to share intelligence, to coordinate arrests and assassinations. If a Chilean dissident fled to Argentina, Condor would find them. If a Brazilian revolutionary sought refuge in Uruguay, they would be arrested and returned for torture and execution. Political refugees were not safe anywhere in South America. The traditional principle of asylum, long honored in the region, was abandoned. Borders became permeable for secret police, but impenetrable for those trying to escape. The numbers defy comprehension. In Argentina alone, between 1976 and 1983, some 30,000 people were disappeared by the military junta. They were taken from their homes, from the streets, from workplaces, universities, churches. They were held in secret detention centers, tortured, killed. Their bodies were thrown into the sea from planes, dumped in mass graves, burned. Pregnant women were kept alive until they gave birth, then murdered, their babies given to military families to raise. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, wearing white headscarves and carrying photographs of their missing children, would march every Thursday in front of the presidential palace, demanding answers that rarely came. In Uruguay, a country of only 3 million people, 1 in 50 was arrested at some point during the dictatorship. Torture was systematic, refined into a science. Prisoners were subjected to extended periods of sensory deprivation, electric shocks, beatings, mock executions. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical. Many of those who survived were broken, traumatized for life. The United States played a complex and troubling role in Operation Condor. American officials knew about it, provided some support and training, but the extent of direct involvement remains disputed. What is clear is that the United States supported the regimes that carried out Condor. Military aid flowed to Argentina, to Chile, to Uruguay. Training at the School of the Americas included counterinsurgency techniques, interrogation methods, intelligence gathering. American officials defended these regimes diplomatically, downplayed human rights abuses, argued that stability and anti-communism were more important than democratic niceties. The logic was similar to that which had guided American policy in Chile. The left in South America, whether through elections or revolution, had to be stopped. If that required supporting military dictatorships, if it meant tolerating mass murder, if it involved complicity in state terror, so be it. The Cold War justified everything. The ends, as always, justified the means. Operation Condor was finally exposed in 1992 when files were discovered in Paraguay detailing its operations. The revelations shocked even those who had suspected the worst. The coordination had been extensive, the victims numerous, the complicity of democratic governments in harboring or tolerating these operations damning. Trials eventually began, convictions were obtained, some justice was served. But for many victims and their families, it came too late, after decades of silence, denial, and impunity. The legacy of Operation Condor endures. In Argentina, the trials of military officers continue decades later. In Chile, Pinochet's detention in London in 1998 on Spanish warrants for human rights abuses opened the door to prosecutions that continue today. In Uruguay, Brazil, and other countries, truth commissions have documented the crimes, memorials have been built, apologies have been issued. But the scars remain, the trauma passed down through generations, the distrust of institutions deeply embedded in the political culture. Nicaragua and the Contras, the proxy war of the 1980s. The 1980s brought a different kind of intervention in Central America, less direct but no less destructive. In Nicaragua, the United States fought a war not with its own soldiers, but through proxies, supporting a counter-revolutionary force known as the Contras against the leftist Sandinista government. It was the longest and most controversial American intervention of the decade, a conflict that divided American opinion, led to congressional investigations and criminal prosecutions, and left Nicaragua devastated. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, named after Augusto Cesar Sandino, the nationalist guerrilla leader who had fought the American occupation in the 1920s and 1930s, had overthrown the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza Debayle in July 1979. Somoza was the third generation of his family to rule Nicaragua, a dynasty that had held power since the 1930s, installed and supported by the United States. The Somoza family had become immensely wealthy, treating the country as a personal fiefdom, while the majority of Nicaraguans lived in crushing poverty. The Sandinista revolution was popular, broad-based, and initially quite moderate. It included not just Marxists, but social democrats, Christians, business people who opposed Somoza's corruption. The revolution promised land reform, literacy campaigns, health care, an end to the Somoza family's monopolistic control of the economy. It did not immediately align with the Soviet Union or Cuba, though it maintained friendly relations with both. But President Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980 on a platform of restoring American strength and rolling back communism, saw the Sandinistas as an intolerable threat. Nicaragua, he warned, could become another Cuba, a Soviet foothold in Central America, a base for exporting revolution to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. The domino theory, discredited by Vietnam, was revived. If Nicaragua fell to communism, others would follow. The Panama Canal would be threatened. Mexico could be destabilized. The threat could reach America's southern border. The Reagan administration made the overthrow of the Sandinistas a priority. The Contras, a loose coalition of former Somoza National Guard members, disaffected Sandinistas, peasants opposed to the new government's agricultural policies, and idealistic anti-communists became the instrument of this policy. The CYA trained them, armed them, funded them. Bases in Honduras served as staging areas, with the full cooperation of the Honduran military, which was itself heavily dependent on American aid. The goal was not necessarily to defeat the Sandinistas militarily, that was probably impossible, but to bleed them, to force them to divert resources from social programs to defense, to make the Nicaraguan people suffer in hopes they would turn against their government. The war was devastating. Over the course of a decade, 50,000 people died, most of them civilians. Infrastructure was destroyed. Mines were laid in harbors, crippling trade. Power stations, clinics, schools, cooperatives were targeted. The Contras, lacking a clear military strategy, often resorted to terror tactics, attacking civilian targets, killing teachers, health workers, agricultural extension agents, anyone associated with the Sandinista government. The economic toll was staggering. Nicaragua's economy, never strong, collapsed under the weight of war and economic embargo. The United States imposed a trade embargo, cut off aid, pressured international institutions to deny loans. The Sandinistas, forced to implement a military draft, lost popular support. Food became scarce. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Young men died in a war that seemed endless. The promises of the revolution, prosperity, justice, peace, faded into bitter disillusionment. The Contra War was also deeply controversial in the United States. Congress, wary of another Vietnam, wary of covert operations that could spiral out of control, passed the Boland Amendments, a series of laws restricting funding for the Contras. But the Reagan administration, unwilling to abandon the cause, sought alternative funding sources. This led to the Iran-Contra scandal, one of the most significant constitutional crises of the 1980s. The scheme was Byzantine. Arms were sold to Iran, which was under an arms embargo and at war with Iraq, through Israeli intermediaries. The profits from these sales were diverted to fund the Contras. The operation violated the Boland Amendments, violated the arms embargo on Iran, and was conducted without congressional knowledge or approval. When the scandal broke in 1986, after a Lebanese magazine published details of the arms sales, it nearly destroyed Reagan's presidency. Congressional hearings exposed the operation. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a National Security Council staff member who had coordinated much of the operation, became a controversial figure, defended by some as a patriot, condemned by others as a rogue operative who had violated the Constitution. Several administration officials were indicted and convicted, though most convictions were later overturned on technicalities. Reagan himself denied detailed knowledge of the operation, claiming that his subordinates had acted without his authorization, a claim that strained credulity but was never definitively disproven. The scandal revealed the extent to which the Reagan administration was willing to go to fight communism in Central America, the willingness to violate laws, to deceive Congress, to engage in operations that blurred the lines between covert action and criminality. But support for the Contras continued, justified by anti-communist ideology and by the belief that the Sandinistas represented an intolerable threat to American interests. In 1990, exhausted by war and economic collapse, Nicaragua held elections. The Sandinistas lost to Violeta Chamorro, a US-backed candidate, the widow of a newspaper editor who had been assassinated by Somoza's regime and later critical of Sandinista policies. It was presented as a victory for democracy, proof that Reagan's policies had worked, that supporting the Contras had been justified. But it was a hollow victory. Nicaragua was left devastated, its people traumatized, its economy in ruins. The war had not brought freedom or prosperity, but suffering and loss. The infrastructure built by the Sandinistas, clinics, schools, cooperatives, was destroyed. A generation had been scarred by violence. Trust in institutions, in political processes, in the possibility of positive change had eroded. The Sandinistas themselves would eventually return to power, but the Nicaragua they governed in the 21st century bore little resemblance to the idealistic vision of 1979. Daniel Ortega, once a revolutionary hero, became an authoritarian leader, manipulating elections, suppressing dissent, enriching his family, as repressive in his own way as the Somoza regime he had once fought. The revolution had come full circle, its promises betrayed, its legacy tarnished. The Contra War demonstrated the limits of proxy warfare. It could destabilize, it could destroy, but it could not build. It could inflict suffering, but not create the conditions for lasting peace or prosperity. And it left behind a legacy of bitterness that poisoned relations between the United States and Nicaragua for generations. A legacy that would influence how Latin Americans viewed American intervention in Venezuela in 2026. El Salvador, supporting death squads in the name of democracy. While Nicaragua dominated headlines in the 1980s, an even bloodier conflict raged next door in El Salvador, a small country about the size of Massachusetts with a population of 5 million. The Salvadoran Civil War, lasting from 1980 to 1992, claimed 75,000 lives, most of them civilians killed by government forces and right-wing death squads. And throughout the conflict, the United States provided massive military and economic aid to the Salvadoran government, despite overwhelming evidence that its forces were committing atrocities on a massive scale. El Salvador's conflict had deep roots. Like Guatemala, it was a country of extreme inequality where a tiny oligarchy controlled vast estates while peasants worked for starvation wages. The 14 families, as the oligarchy was known, owned most of the coffee plantations that dominated the economy. They controlled the government, the military, the courts. Any challenge to their power was met with violence. In 1932, a peasant uprising led by Farabundo Martí and influenced by communist ideas was crushed with extreme brutality. Over 30,000 peasants, most of them indigenous, were massacred in a campaign known as La Matanza, the slaughter. It set a precedent, established a pattern of state violence that would repeat itself 50 years later. By the late 1970s, El Salvador was once again on the brink. Popular movements demanding reform were met with repression. Priests influenced by liberation theology, who preached that the church should stand with the poor, were targeted. In March 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero, the country's most prominent religious leader, who had spoken out against the violence, was assassinated while saying, "Mass." He had been shot by a right-wing death squad, with the complicity of powerful figures in the military and oligarchy. Later that year, leftist groups united to form the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, the FMLN, a guerrilla army that would wage war against the government for the next 12 years. The FMLN was not a monolithic organization, but a coalition of 5 groups with different ideologies and tactics. Some were Marxist-Leninists aligned with Cuba and the Soviet Union. Others were more moderate, inspired by the Sandinistas or by Christian socialism. What united them was opposition to the government, to the oligarchy, to the military that protected elite interests through violence. The Reagan administration viewed the conflict in El Salvador through the lens of the Cold War. The FMLN was seen as a communist insurgency supported by Nicaragua, Cuba, and ultimately the Soviet Union. If the FMLN won, El Salvador would fall, Nicaragua would be emboldened, Guatemala and Honduras would be next. The dominoes would fall. The response was to prop up the Salvadoran government, to provide whatever support was necessary to prevent a leftist victory. Between 1980 and 1992, the United States poured more than $6 billion into El Salvador, making it one of the highest per capita recipients of American aid in the world. Most of the aid was military: weapons, helicopters, training, intelligence support. American military advisors, though officially limited to 55, were sent to train the Salvadoran military in counterinsurgency tactics. The U.S. Army School of the Americas trained thousands of Salvadoran officers, many of whom would later be implicated in human rights abuses. The Salvadoran military used this aid to wage a brutal campaign against the insurgency and against civilians suspected of supporting it. Entire villages were massacred. In December 1981, in the village of El Mozote and surrounding hamlets, government forces killed nearly 1,000 people, including hundreds of children. Soldiers went house to house, separating men from women, executing them in groups, burning the bodies. It was the worst massacre in modern Latin American history, and it was carried out by a military unit that had been trained by the United States. The Reagan administration, when reports of the massacre emerged, denied them. Officials claimed the reports were guerrilla propaganda, that the numbers were exaggerated, that there was no credible evidence of a massacre. American credibility depended on supporting the Salvadoran government, on maintaining the narrative that American-backed forces were the good guys, defending democracy against communist totalitarianism. Admitting that U.S.-trained troops had massacred children would undermine that narrative, would give ammunition to critics of the war, would make it harder to sustain congressional support for aid. Only years later, after the war ended, after a truth commission investigated and exhumed mass graves, was the scale of the El Mozote massacre confirmed. By then, many of those responsible had escaped justice, protected by an amnesty law that the Salvadoran government passed to ensure peace. El Mozote was not an isolated incident. Throughout the war, death squads operated with impunity, killing labor leaders, teachers, students, priests, nuns, journalists, anyone suspected of leftist sympathies. In December 1980, 4 American churchwomen, including 3 nuns, were raped and murdered by National Guardsmen. The Reagan administration's initial response was to suggest that the women might have been involved with the guerrillas, that they bore some responsibility for their own deaths. Only after public outrage did the administration pursue justice, and even then, only low-level soldiers were convicted, while the officers who ordered the killings were protected. The FMLN was not innocent in the conflict. They too committed atrocities, assassinated mayors and local officials, attacked infrastructure, used landmines that killed and maimed civilians. But the vast majority of civilian deaths, between 70 and 85% according to truth commissions, were caused by government forces and allied death squads. And those forces were armed, trained, funded, and defended by the United States. The war ended in 1992 with a negotiated settlement. The FMLN agreed to disarm and participate in democratic politics. The military agreed to reforms, to purges of officers implicated in atrocities, to acceptance of the FMLN as a political party. The Truth Commission documented the crimes, named names, recommended justice. But an amnesty law, passed days after the Truth Commission's report, ensured that almost no one was held accountable. El Salvador was left devastated. 75,000 dead, 1 million displaced, the economy shattered, a generation traumatized by violence. The FMLN became a political party and eventually won the presidency in 2009. But the country never fully recovered. Gang violence, much of it imported from the United States when Salvadoran refugees were deported back to a country they barely remembered, made El Salvador one of the most violent countries in the world. Migration to the United States continued as Salvadorans fled poverty and violence, seeking safety and opportunity in the country that had helped create the conditions they were fleeing. Panama, 1989. Just Cause and the Capture of Noriega. On December 20th, 1989, just weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall symbolically ended the Cold War, the United States launched Operation Just Cause, a full-scale invasion of Panama. It was the largest American military operation since Vietnam, involving 24,000 troops, sophisticated stealth aircraft, special forces, Marines, paratroopers. The objective was singular and personal: to capture Manuel Noriega, Panama's de facto leader, and bring him to the United States to face drug trafficking charges. The invasion was a preview of things to come, a demonstration that even with the Cold War ending, even with communism in retreat, American intervention in Latin America would continue. The justifications would change. Drugs instead of communism, but the pattern would remain the same. Manuel Noriega was a complicated figure, a product of American policy who eventually became its victim. He had risen through Panama's National Guard, the military force created and trained by the United States during its long occupation of the Canal Zone. He had worked with the CIA since the 1960s, providing intelligence, facilitating operations against Cuba and Nicaragua, supporting the Contras. He was Washington's man in Panama, reliable, useful, willing to do things that more fastidious allies might decline. But Noriega was also deeply corrupt. He enriched himself through drug trafficking, allowing Colombian cartels to use Panama as a transshipment point, laundering their money through Panamanian banks. He manipulated elections, suppressed opposition, ruled through fear and a network of informants. As long as he was useful to the United States, these activities were overlooked, tolerated as the price of cooperation in the Cold War. By the late 1980s, however, Noriega had become a liability. His involvement in drug trafficking was an embarrassment at a time when the Reagan administration was waging a high-profile war on drugs. His increasingly erratic behavior, his defiance of American pressure, his willingness to play the nationalist card against the United States made him intolerable. When he was indicted by federal grand juries in Miami in 1988 on drug trafficking charges, it became a personal challenge to President George H.W. Bush, who had served as CIA director when Noriega was recruited and now faced questions about what he had known and when. Economic sanctions were imposed, but Noriega did not budge. Elections in 1989 were widely believed to have been stolen by Noriega, with the winning opposition candidates beaten in the streets by Noriega's dignity battalions. An October coup attempt by dissident military officers failed when the United States, despite knowing about the coup in advance, provided only minimal support. The plotters were captured and executed. By December, Bush decided that Noriega had to go. A series of incidents, the shooting of an American Marine by Panamanian soldiers, the harassment of an American naval officer and his wife, provided the final pretext. Operation Just Cause was launched in the early hours of December 20th, 1989, timed for maximum surprise and minimum Panamanian resistance. The invasion was swift and overwhelming. American forces secured key locations within hours: the airport, military bases, Noriega's headquarters. But the fighting was not entirely one-sided. Noriega's dignity battalions resisted in some neighborhoods. American forces responded with massive firepower. The Chorrillo neighborhood, a poor area near Noriega's headquarters, was devastated by fighting and fires. Hundreds of civilians died, though exact numbers were never determined and remain disputed. Noriega himself escaped the initial assault. For days, American forces searched for him, offering rewards, broadcasting messages, surrounding his possible hideouts. On Christmas Eve, he sought refuge in the Vatican embassy, claiming asylum. American forces surrounded the embassy, played loud rock music to pressure him and the papal nuncio, created a bizarre spectacle that was broadcast around the world. On January 3, 1990, exactly 36 years before the capture of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, Noriega surrendered. He was taken to Miami, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 40 years in prison, later reduced to 30. The invasion was justified on multiple grounds: the protection of American lives, the defense of the Panama Canal, the need to restore democracy, the fight against drug trafficking. But to many in Latin America, it looked like something far simpler and older: a reassertion of American dominance, a reminder that sovereignty, even for nations allied with the United States, had its limits. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the invasion as a violation of international law. The Organization of American States passed a resolution deploring it. But the United States vetoed a similar resolution in the UN Security Council, and the invasion stood. The Panama invasion was significant for several reasons. It demonstrated that, even with the Cold War ending, American willingness to use military force in Latin America had not diminished. It showed that drug trafficking could serve as a justification for intervention, much as communism had during the Cold War. It established a precedent for regime change based on criminal indictments. The idea that the United States could effectively arrest foreign heads of state and bring them to trial in American courts. And it left Panama in a situation familiar from other American interventions. The immediate objective achieved, but the long-term consequences uncertain and often negative. Noriega was gone, but Panama was left with damaged infrastructure, traumatized population, weak institutions. Democracy was restored, but corruption continued, drug trafficking continued, poverty continued. The underlying problems that had created the conditions for Noriega's rise remained unaddressed. 37 years later, when Donald Trump ordered the capture of Nicolas Maduro on the same date, January 3rd, the parallels were striking. The same justifications: drug trafficking, protecting American interests, restoring democracy. The same methods: military force, defiance of international law, assertion of hemispheric dominance. The same confidence that American power could remove foreign leaders and that the consequences could be managed. History was not repeating itself precisely, but it was rhyming in ways that were both familiar and troubling. The shift east, the Korean War, and America's Asian interventions. While Latin America was the primary theater of American intervention in the Western Hemisphere, Asia became the proving ground for containment policy, the place where the Cold War turned hot, where hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fought and died, where millions of Asian civilians perished in conflicts shaped by superpower rivalry. The Korean War, which began in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea, was the first major military conflict of the Cold War. It was presented to the American public as a clear case of communist aggression, of naked invasion by a Soviet satellite determined to conquer its democratic neighbor. The reality was more complex. Korea had been divided arbitrarily at the end of World War II. Both sides claimed to represent all Koreans. Both sides had launched raids across the border, but the invasion was real, and it demanded a response. President Harry Truman, without seeking a congressional declaration of war, committed American forces to defend South Korea. It was a momentous decision, a commitment of American power that would shape the Cold War for the next 4 decades. The United States would not allow communist expansion by military force. Containment would be enforced not just diplomatically and economically, but militarily if necessary. The initial stages of the war went badly for South Korea and its American defenders. North Korean forces, well-trained and well-armed with Soviet weapons, pushed south rapidly. By August, United Nations and South Korean forces were pinned in a small perimeter around the port of Pusan, in danger of being pushed into the sea. But General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American forces, executed a brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind North Korean lines. The North Korean army, its supply lines cut, collapsed. Within weeks, South Korea was liberated, and American forces were pushing north, crossing the 38th parallel, driving toward the Chinese border. This was the fateful decision that transformed the war. The original UN mandate was to repel the invasion, to restore the status quo. But Truman and MacArthur, emboldened by success, sought to reunify Korea by force, to eliminate the communist North. It was a miscalculation with catastrophic consequences. China, fearing an American army on its border, warned that it would intervene if US forces continued north. The warnings were ignored or dismissed. In November 1950, Chinese forces, hundreds of thousands of volunteers, crossed the Yalu River and struck the advancing American and South Korean forces. The result was one of the worst defeats in American military history. In bitter cold, in mountainous terrain, American forces were overwhelmed by Chinese human wave attacks. The retreat from the Chosin Reservoir became legendary. A fighting withdrawal in which Marines battled through Chinese encirclement, suffering terrible casualties from combat and frostbite. The war, which had seemed won, was suddenly in doubt. Over the next 3 years, the war settled into a stalemate along roughly the original border, the 38th parallel. Negotiations began but dragged on, with both sides unwilling to compromise, with prisoners of war becoming a major, stumbling block. Meanwhile, the fighting continued, brutal and destructive. The American air campaign over North Korea was one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in history. Between 1950 and 1953, the U.S. Air Force dropped more tonnage of bombs on the Korean Peninsula than it had dropped on the entire Pacific theater during World War II. Cities and villages were flattened. Dams and irrigation works were systematically destroyed, producing widespread famine. Napalm was used extensively, incinerating entire towns. By the war's end, virtually every structure in North Korea had been destroyed. The civilian death toll was staggering. Estimates range from 2 to 3 million, a significant fraction of North Korea's pre-war population. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the Strategic Air Command and oversaw much of the bombing, later reflected that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal for what was done to North Korean civilians. But the United States did not lose, and the bombing was justified as military necessity, as the only way to pressure China and North Korea to negotiate. The war ended in July 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty. The border remained roughly where it had been at the start. Korea remained divided, with a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, separating North and South. American troops remained in South Korea, tens of thousands of them, a permanent military presence meant to deter another North Korean invasion. The troops remain there today, nearly 75 years later, a reminder of an unfinished war, of a conflict that never formally ended. The Korean War established several precedents that would shape American intervention in Asia. It demonstrated American willingness to fight limited wars to contain communism, to commit significant forces to conflicts that did not directly threaten American territory. It established the pattern of air warfare as the primary American military response to conflicts in Asia, a pattern that would be repeated in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia. And it created a permanent American military presence in the region, a network of bases and alliances designed to contain first the Soviet Union and China, and later just China as the Soviet Union collapsed. For Korea itself, the war was a catastrophe. Millions dead, infrastructure destroyed, families divided. The division of the peninsula, meant to be temporary, became permanent. The two Koreas developed along radically different paths. South Korea eventually becoming a prosperous democracy, North Korea a closed totalitarian state, one of the most repressive regimes in the world. The war left a legacy of trauma, of unresolved grievances, of a conflict frozen in time, but never resolved. Vietnam, the longest war and the limits of power. If Korea was the first test of American containment policy in Asia, Vietnam was the most comprehensive, the most traumatic, the most consequential. The Vietnam War lasted nearly 20 years, from American support for French colonial forces in the early 1950s to the fall of Saigon in 1975. It cost 58,000 American lives, more than 3 million Vietnamese lives, and it left scars on American society and politics that persist to this day. The roots of American involvement go back to World War II, when the Vietnamese independence movement, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought against Japanese occupation with American support. When the war ended, Ho expected American support for Vietnamese independence from France, citing American principles of self-determination. Instead, the United States, seeking to maintain good relations with France, a key ally in the emerging Cold War, supported French efforts to reassert colonial control. The First Indochina War between France and the Viet Minh lasted from 1946 to 1954. By the early 1950s, the United States was paying for most of the French war effort, seeing it as part of the broader struggle against communist expansion in Asia. But the Viet Minh, with Chinese support, proved impossible to defeat. In May 1954, at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam, the French army was surrounded and forced to surrender. It was a humiliating defeat that ended French colonialism in Indochina. The Geneva Accords of 1954 divided Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh's government controlling the north and a pro-Western government controlling the south. Elections were to be held in 1956 to reunify the country, but the United States, convinced that Ho would win any free election, supported South Vietnam's refusal to hold them. The temporary division became permanent, and Vietnam, like Korea, became a divided nation, a front line in the Cold War. The United States poured aid into South Vietnam, building up its military, supporting the government of Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist in a predominantly Buddhist country, a man of rigid principles and little political skill. Diem's government was corrupt, repressive, increasingly unpopular. His refusal to implement land reform alienated peasants. His persecution of Buddhists, culminating in the self-immolation of monks protesting his policies, shocked the world. In 1963, with American acquiescence, South Vietnamese military officers overthrew and killed Diem. It was hoped that new leadership might stabilize the country, but instead, the coup ushered in a period of political chaos, with governments rising and falling in quick succession. Meanwhile, insurgency in the south intensified. The Viet Cong, a guerrilla force supported by North Vietnam, controlled large swaths of the countryside, taxing peasants, assassinating local officials, attacking military outposts. The South Vietnamese army, despite American training and equipment, proved unable to counter the insurgency effectively. American advisors, sent to train and assist, were increasingly drawn into combat. Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson faced the same choice: escalate American involvement or accept the likely collapse of South Vietnam. Each chose escalation, each step justified as necessary to prevent the previous investment from being wasted. Advisors became support troops. Support troops became combat forces. Airstrikes became bombing campaigns. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam, and the war had expanded into neighboring Laos and Cambodia as the United States tried to disrupt North Vietnamese supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The American strategy was attrition, to kill enough enemy fighters that North Vietnam would conclude the war was unwinnable and negotiate. Body counts became the metric of success. But the strategy failed. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, though suffering terrible casualties, were willing to accept losses that would have broken Western armies. They were fighting for national unification on their own territory, with the support of much of the population. The United States was fighting for an abstract principle, containment, in a country most Americans could not locate on a map. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 shattered American illusions about the war. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on cities and military bases across South Vietnam. The attacks were eventually repulsed, and the Viet Cong suffered devastating losses. But the offensive demonstrated that despite years of American involvement, despite massive firepower, the enemy retained the initiative, could strike anywhere, was far from defeated. For the American public, watching the war on television, seeing the American embassy in Saigon under attack, hearing military and political leaders admit that the war was far from won, the Tet Offensive was a turning point. Support for the war, already eroding, collapsed. Protests intensified. President Johnson, facing a challenge within his own party, announced he would not seek re-election. The war had broken his presidency. Richard Nixon, elected in 1968 on promises of peace with honor, pursued a strategy of Vietnamization, transferring the war to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. But the war continued and it expanded. In 1970, American forces invaded Cambodia to attack North Vietnamese bases there, triggering massive protests in the United States and abroad. In 1972, North Vietnam launched another major offensive, and the United States responded with intensive bombing of North Vietnam, including the Christmas bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong, which killed thousands of civilians. Peace negotiations finally produced an agreement in January 1973. American forces would withdraw, prisoners would be exchanged, and the political future of South Vietnam would be determined by the Vietnamese themselves. It was, in effect, a defeat dressed up as compromise. American forces left, but the North Vietnamese army remained in the south. Everyone knew the war would resume once American forces were gone. It did. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive. South Vietnamese resistance collapsed with stunning speed. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The last Americans were evacuated by helicopter from the roof of the American embassy in chaotic scenes broadcast around the world. Vietnam was unified under communist rule, exactly the outcome that 20 years of American intervention had sought to prevent. The human cost of the war was staggering. Nearly 60,000 Americans killed, over 300,000 wounded, many of them permanently disabled. 2 million Vietnamese civilians died, along with more than 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. 3 million Vietnamese were exposed to Agent Orange, a defoliant used to destroy jungle cover, leaving legacies of cancer, birth defects, and environmental damage that persist today. Laos and Cambodia, drawn into the war despite their neutrality, suffered massive casualties and destabilization. In Cambodia, the spillover effects contributed to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, whose genocidal rule from 1975 to 1979 killed more than 1 million people. For the United States, Vietnam became a symbol of the limits of military power, of the dangers of hubris, of the folly of fighting wars without clear objectives or public support. The Vietnam Syndrome, the reluctance to commit American forces to foreign conflicts, shaped American foreign policy for a generation. But the lessons learned were not always applied, and the temptation to intervene, to use American power to shape the world, remained strong. Indonesia, 1965. The mass killings and American complicity. While Vietnam dominated American attention in Southeast Asia during the 1960s, another intervention, more covert and in some ways more consequential, took place in Indonesia. The Indonesian intervention demonstrated that American Cold War policy could support not just military action, but mass killing, that hundreds of thousands could die with American complicity, and that these deaths could be rationalized as necessary to prevent communist expansion. Indonesia, in the early 1960s, was the 5th most populous nation in the world, strategically located along crucial shipping lanes, resource-rich, and led by Sukarno, a charismatic nationalist who had led the country to independence from the Netherlands. Sukarno practiced what he called guided democracy, balancing the Indonesian military, nationalist parties, and the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI, which was the 3rd largest communist party in the world after those of China and the Soviet Union. The United States viewed Sukarno with suspicion and the PKI with alarm. In 1958, the CYA had supported a regional rebellion against Sukarno's government, providing arms and even air support. The rebellion failed, embarrassing the United States when an American pilot was shot down and captured. But American efforts to influence Indonesian politics continued. In September 1965, a group of junior military officers launched an attempted coup, killing 6 senior generals. The coup collapsed within days, but it triggered a violent response. General Suharto, who emerged as the military's leader, blamed the PKI for the coup, though evidence of communist involvement was circumstantial at best. What followed was one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century. Over the next 6 months, the Indonesian military, with the support of Islamic and nationalist groups, carried out a systematic campaign to destroy the PK1 and its alleged sympathizers. Communists, suspected communists, ethnic Chinese, intellectuals, labor leaders, peasants who had supported land reform, all became targets. Entire villages were wiped out. Bodies were thrown into rivers, buried in mass graves, left in the streets as warnings. The killings were carried out with machetes, clubs, guns, with neighbors turning on neighbors, with militias encouraged by the military and religious authorities. The death toll has never been precisely determined. Estimates range from 500,000 to more than 1 million. It was genocide not based on ethnicity alone, but on political belief, on class, on association. The PKI, which had millions of members and supporters, was obliterated. Indonesia's political landscape was transformed overnight. And throughout this, the United States supported Suharto and the Indonesian military. American officials saw the mass killings as an opportunity, a chance to eliminate communist influence in Southeast Asia's largest nation. The CIA provided lists of communist leaders to the Indonesian military, facilitating arrests and executions. American officials encouraged the military to act decisively to complete the purge. Economic and military aid continued to flow, rewarding Suharto for his anti-communist zeal. In Washington, the killings were celebrated as a triumph. Time magazine called them the West's best news for years in Asia. Secretary of State Dean Rusk spoke approvingly of Indonesia's new direction. The U.S. ambassador to Indonesia, Marshall Green, later received a Distinguished Service Award for his role during that period. The mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people was seen not as a humanitarian catastrophe, but as a Cold War victory. Suharto would rule Indonesia for 32 years, until 1998. His regime, though often described in Western media as moderate, was authoritarian and corrupt. Political opposition was suppressed. Press freedom was curtailed. East Timor was invaded in 1975, leading to another campaign of mass killing that claimed perhaps 200,000 lives. Yet Western governments, including the United States, continued to support Suharto, to provide aid, to do business with his regime. He was anti-communist, pro-Western, and that was what mattered. The Indonesian killings of 1965 to 66 are often forgotten or minimized in discussions of Cold War interventions. Unlike Vietnam, there were no American combat troops involved, no television coverage, no domestic opposition. The killings happened in remote villages, away from Western eyes, and the victims were communists or alleged communists, people with little voice in international forums. But the scale of the killing, and American complicity in it, represents one of the darkest chapters in Cold War history, a reminder of how far the United States was willing to go to prevent communist influence, even when it meant tacit support for genocide. The post-Cold War era. New justifications for old patterns. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, the primary justification for American intervention vanished overnight. Communism, the great enemy, the existential threat that had shaped policy for nearly half a century, was no more. The Cold War was over, won by the West without the nuclear holocaust that many had feared. For a brief moment, there was hope that the era of intervention might end, that the United States might finally step back and allow other nations to chart their own courses, that the peace dividend from reduced military spending could be invested in domestic priorities. Francis Fukuyama famously declared the end of history, arguing that liberal democracy had triumphed, that the great ideological struggles were over, that the future would be one of gradual convergence toward Western-style capitalism and democracy. It was a vision of a new world order, benign and orderly, with the United States as the sole superpower presiding over a gradually democratizing planet. But that moment of optimism was brief. New justifications for intervention emerged quickly, new threats were identified, new reasons found to deploy American military power abroad. The world, it turned out, had not become simple or safe just because the Cold War had ended. Regional conflicts, ethnic violence, failed states, terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, all provided rationales for continued American engagement, often military engagement, around the world. In Latin America specifically, the end of the Cold War did not end intervention, but changed its justification. The war on drugs became the primary framework, replacing anti-communism as the rationale for American military involvement in the region. Drug trafficking was presented as a national security threat, a scourge that had to be fought abroad to protect Americans at home. If we don't fight the drug traffickers in Colombia or Mexico, the logic went, we'll have to fight the consequences: addiction, crime, social breakdown in American cities. The logic was remarkably similar to containment. Just as communist expansion had to be stopped in distant countries to prevent it from reaching American shores, drug trafficking had to be stopped at its source to keep drugs out of the United States. And just as with anti-communism, the results were often counterproductive, creating as many problems as they solved. Plan Colombia, launched in 2000, provided massive military aid to the Colombian government to fight leftist guerrillas and drug cartels. Over 2 decades, the United States poured more than $10 billion into Colombia, making it the largest recipient of U.S. military aid outside the Middle East. The program achieved some of its objectives. The FARC guerrillas were weakened, coca cultivation was reduced in some areas, violence declined in major cities. But the program also led to significant human rights abuses, displacement of millions of rural Colombians, environmental damage from aerial fumigation campaigns, and the balloon effect. Cocaine production shifted from Colombia to Peru and Bolivia, and later back to Colombia when those countries cracked down. Drug trafficking routes shifted but never disappeared. The flow of cocaine to the United States continued, adapting to interdiction efforts, finding new routes, new methods, new organizations. In Mexico, the situation was even more problematic. Beginning in the mid-2000s, the United States pressured the Mexican government to wage a military campaign against drug cartels. The Merida Initiative provided billions in security assistance. Mexican military and police forces engaged in direct combat with cartels. The result was catastrophic violence. Over 300,000 people killed over 15 years. Tens of thousands disappeared. corruption metastasizing throughout Mexican institutions, refugees fleeing to the United States. The war on drugs, like the war on communism before it, became a framework that justified intervention while rarely questioning the effectiveness of that intervention or the human cost. American demand for drugs continued unabated. American guns flowed south to arm the cartels, but the solution was always framed as more enforcement, more military aid, more aggressive action in the countries producing or transporting drugs, rarely addressing the underlying issues of demand, inequality, or the perverse incentives created by prohibition. Other forms of intervention continued as well. In 2002, the United States supported a coup attempt against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Though the coup failed and American involvement was exposed, it demonstrated that even after the Cold War, the United States remained willing to subvert democratically elected governments that challenged American interests. In 2009, when a military coup overthrew President Manuel Zelaya of Honduras, the U.S. response was muted despite calls from across the hemisphere for stronger condemnation. Zelaya had moved left, aligned with Chavez, supported regional integration that excluded the United States. His removal was quietly welcomed in Washington, even if it couldn't be publicly endorsed. The patterns established during the Cold War persisted. The justifications changed: drugs, democracy promotion, humanitarian intervention, counterterrorism, but the underlying dynamic remained. American power, once mobilized, was difficult to restrain, and the interests that drove intervention, economic, strategic, ideological, remained constant even as the world around them transformed. Trump's Monroe Doctrine. Continuity and departure. When Donald Trump stood before reporters at Mar-a-Lago on January 4, 2026, to announce the capture of Nicolas Maduro, he was invoking a tradition that stretched back more than 2 centuries. The Monroe Doctrine, reimagined as the Monroe Doctrine, was presented as both a return to foundational principles and a bold new assertion of American power in the hemisphere. But more than rhetoric, Trump's actions in Venezuela represented both continuity with past interventions and departures that made his approach distinctive. The continuities were striking. Like interventions past, Trump's Venezuela operation was justified by a mixture of security concerns and moral claims. Drug trafficking, the threat of foreign adversaries gaining influence, the need to restore democracy. These were familiar rationales, echoing justifications used in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, and countless other interventions over the previous century. The operational pattern was also familiar. Economic pressure had been applied first. Sanctions choking Venezuela's oil exports, freezing assets, cutting off access to international finance. Covert support for opposition groups had been provided. Military pressure had been gradually escalated. Naval blockades, strikes on alleged drug trafficking boats, deployment of military assets to the region. And finally, when these measures failed to produce the desired result, direct military action to remove the offending leader. Trump's actions in Venezuela followed this pattern almost exactly. For months before the January 2026 strikes, his administration had tightened sanctions, backed opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, and deployed military forces to waters off Venezuela. The capture of Maduro was the culmination of this escalation, not an isolated act, but the final step in a sustained campaign. But there were also significant departures from past practice. Trump's approach was more overt than the covert operations of the Cold War. There was less effort at plausible deniability, less concern for maintaining the fiction of local action without American involvement. The operation to capture Maduro was bold, public, unapologetic. It was presented not as a regrettable necessity, but as a triumph, a restoration of American prestige, a reassertion of dominance in the hemisphere. The rhetoric was also different. Previous American presidents, even while intervening, had often expressed regret about the necessity, had framed interventions as unfortunate but unavoidable, had promised they would be exceptions rather than the rule. They spoke of respecting sovereignty, of supporting the principle of non-intervention even while violating it, of acting reluctantly only when all other options were exhausted. Trump embraced the role of hemispheric hegemon openly and without apology. The Monroe Doctrine was not presented as a defensive measure, as the original Monroe Doctrine had been, but as an assertion of dominance. "This is our hemisphere," Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared, "and we will not allow it to be a base of operations for our adversaries." The language was reminiscent of Theodore Roosevelt, of the era when American power was unabashed, when empire was not a dirty word but a source of national pride. This represented a departure from the post-World War II order, where American power was exercised within a framework of international institutions and norms. The United Nations, the Organization of American States, international law, these had always constrained American action to some degree, providing legitimacy when they could be invoked, creating political costs when they were defied. Trump showed little concern for these constraints. When the UN Security Council moved to condemn the Venezuela operation, the United States simply vetoed the resolution and dismissed international criticism. Trump's approach was more unilateral, more transactional, more willing to use force as a first resort rather than a last one. It signaled a shift toward a worldview where might makes right, where international institutions are obstacles to be bypassed rather than frameworks to be respected, where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This had implications beyond Venezuela. Trump had already threatened Colombia, whose president had criticized the Venezuela operation. He had hinted at action against Cuba and Nicaragua. He had made threatening statements about Greenland, suggesting he might annex it despite it being a Danish territory and part of NATO. His administration had published a national security strategy that explicitly invoked a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, committing to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. The reaction across Latin America was predictably divided. Right-wing governments in Argentina, Colombia under previous leadership, and El Salvador praised the action. They saw in Maduro a tyrant, a threat to regional stability, and his removal as long overdue. They welcomed American intervention as they had in the past, when it aligned with their interests and ideology. But left-wing governments in Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and Petro's Colombia condemned what they saw as a violation of sovereignty, a return to the worst days of American imperialism in the region. Brazil's President Lula called it a return to the worst moments of interference in Latin American politics. Mexico's President Sheinbaum warned of a dangerous precedent. The international legal framework that had evolved since World War II, weak as it often was, provided at least some constraints on the use of force. Trump's action threatened to sweep those constraints aside. Comparing the interventions. Patterns across decades. Looking across the century of interventions from Guatemala in 1954 to Venezuela in 2026, certain patterns emerge with striking clarity. These patterns reveal not isolated incidents, but a systematic approach to the use of American power, a consistent set of assumptions about America's role in the world, and a troubling disconnect between stated objectives and actual outcomes. First, the justifications change, but the substance remains remarkably consistent. In the early 20th century, interventions were justified by commercial interests and the need for stability. During the Cold War, anti-communism became the primary rationale. After the Cold War, drugs, democracy promotion, and counterterrorism filled the void. With Trump, it was a mixture of all these: drugs, foreign influence, protecting American interests. But beneath these shifting justifications, the actions themselves remained similar. The use of military force, economic pressure, and covert operations to remove governments deemed hostile to American interests and install ones more compliant. Second, the interventions rarely achieved their stated long-term objectives. Governments were overthrown, leaders captured or killed, but the underlying problems, poverty, inequality, weak institutions, social conflict, persisted or worsened. Guatemala after Arbenz descended into 4 decades of civil war and genocide. Chile after Allende suffered 17 years of dictatorship. Nicaragua after the Sandinistas' first period in power was left devastated, only to see the Sandinistas return later as authoritarians. Panama after Noriega continued to struggle with corruption and drug trafficking. Iraq and Afghanistan, though outside Latin America, followed similar patterns: short-term military success, followed by long-term chaos and failure. The pattern was clear. American interventions could destroy, but they could not build. They could remove governments, but not create stable, prosperous, democratic societies. The follow-through necessary to address root causes was rarely provided. American attention spans were short, commitment conditional. Once the immediate crisis was resolved and the offending government removed, resources and attention moved elsewhere, leaving countries to cope with the aftermath. Third, the human cost of these interventions was borne almost entirely by the people of the nations intervened in. Hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans died in wars and repressions linked directly or indirectly to American intervention. Millions were displaced from their homes, their lands, their countries. Economies were shattered, setting back development by decades. Entire generations grew up in violence, knowing nothing but war, their childhoods stolen, their futures foreclosed. The asymmetry was total. The United States waged these conflicts far from its own shores, with its own territory never threatened, its own cities never bombed, its own civilians never displaced by the millions. American casualties, while tragic for the families involved, were relatively small. The economic costs, while significant, never threatened American prosperity. The wars were fought over there, in places most Americans couldn't locate on a map, against enemies they would never meet, for objectives that were often abstract and poorly defined. This asymmetry made it easier for Americans to support, or at least tolerate, interventions. The costs were borne by others. The consequences played out in distant lands. Only when American casualties mounted, as in Vietnam, did significant domestic opposition emerge. Otherwise, interventions could continue indefinitely, with little political cost to those who ordered them. Fourth, the interventions consistently undermined the very values they claimed to promote: democracy, human rights, self-determination, the rule of law. These were invoked constantly as justifications. But the reality was often the opposite. Democratically elected governments were overthrown and replaced with dictatorships. Human rights abuses by allied regimes were overlooked, minimized, or actively supported. The sovereignty of nations was violated in the name of a higher good that often never materialized. International law was respected when convenient and ignored when it constrained American action. This hypocrisy was not lost on the people of Latin America and other regions where American intervention was common. They heard American leaders speak of democracy while supporting dictators. They heard proclamations about human rights while American trained forces committed massacres. They heard promises of development while American policies impoverished their countries. The gap between rhetoric and reality, between stated values and actual actions, bred cynicism, resentment, and a deep distrust of American intentions that persists to this day. Fifth, the interventions created cycles of resentment and retaliation that perpetuated conflict rather than resolving it. The nations most frequently targeted by American intervention became the most hostile to the United States. Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, all were targeted repeatedly. All became implacable enemies. All used the history of intervention to justify their own authoritarian measures, to rally nationalist sentiment, to deflect blame for their failures onto foreign interference. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. American intervention bred anti-American nationalism. Nationalist governments, often repressive and economically dysfunctional, blamed their problems on American hostility, sometimes accurately. This hostility was then used to justify further American intervention. The cycle was vicious and difficult to break. Leaders like Fidel Castro, Daniel Ortega, and Hugo Chavez used American intervention as a central part of their political identity, their legitimacy resting in part on their defiance of the United States. The cost of empire, a century of consequences. As we look back on this long history, from the Monroe Doctrine to the Monroe Doctrine, from Theodore Roosevelt's Big Stick to Donald Trump's capture of Maduro, a question emerges insistently. What was it all for? What did the United States gain from a century of intervention in Latin America and Asia? And what did it cost? Not just in dollars, though the financial cost was enormous, but in lives, in moral authority, in trust, in the possibility of genuine partnership with nations that should have been allies but became adversaries. The gains are genuinely difficult to quantify. Some interventions protected American economic interests in the short term, ensuring that American companies could operate profitably, that strategic resources remained accessible, that markets stayed open. The United Fruit Company benefited from the Guatemala coup. American oil companies benefited from interventions in various countries. American banks and corporations found opportunities in economies opened by force or by the threat of force. Some interventions prevented the spread of communism to additional countries, though whether that spread would have occurred without intervention is unknowable. The counterfactual is forever obscure. Would Chile have become a Soviet satellite if Allende had remained in power? Almost certainly not. Allende was a democratic socialist, not a Stalinist, and Chile's democratic traditions were too strong. Would Nicaragua have threatened American security if the Sandinistas had been left alone? The evidence suggests not. They were a poor country with a small military, hardly capable of projecting power beyond their borders. Some interventions removed leaders who were genuinely tyrannical, though often replacing them with tyrants of a different kind. Somoza was a brutal dictator, but so was the Contra War that replaced his successors. Maduro's Venezuela was repressive and economically dysfunctional, but whether the instability following his removal would be better remained to be seen. The gains, such as they were often tactical and temporary, but the costs were strategic and enduring. The United States earned a reputation in much of the developing world as an imperial power, hypocritical in its rhetoric about freedom and democracy. The phrase Yankee imperialism was not just leftist propaganda, but a description grounded in historical experience, in the repeated pattern of American forces arriving to overthrow governments, support dictators, and shape societies according to American preferences. Anti-American sentiment, which might have been confined to small radical groups, became mainstream in many countries. Leaders who might have been pragmatic partners became implacable enemies. The possibility of genuine cooperation, of relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than coercion and dominance, was foreclosed. Latin America developed a deep skepticism of American intentions that made even beneficial proposals suspect. The human cost was immense and largely invisible to Americans. While exact figures will never be known, conservative estimates suggest that interventions and the conflicts they sparked resulted in millions of deaths across Latin America and Asia. In Guatemala alone, 200,000 people died in a civil war that followed directly from the 1954 coup. In Indonesia, between 500,000 and 1 million were killed in the 1965 to 1966 purges supported by the United States. In Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, more than 3 million civilians died. In El Salvador, 75,000. In Nicaragua, 50,000. In Chile, thousands more under Pinochet. These were not mere statistics, but human beings with families, dreams, potential, children who never grew up, parents who never saw their children again, communities destroyed, cultures damaged. The psychological trauma was passed down through generations, shaping politics, society, and individual psyches in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Tens of millions were displaced, refugees fleeing war, repression, or economic collapse, caused directly or indirectly by American intervention. Many ended up in the United States, creating the very immigration problem that American politicians would later use to justify more intervention, more militarization of borders, more walls and fences. The connection between American foreign policy and immigration was rarely acknowledged, but it was real and direct. Economic costs were similarly devastating. Entire countries were set back by decades. Infrastructure destroyed in wars had to be rebuilt, if it could be rebuilt at all. Educated classes fled, creating brain drains that persisted for generations. Investment dried up as countries became known for instability and violence. The opportunity costs, what these countries might have achieved with stability, with resources invested in development rather than war, were incalculable. And there was a cost to American democracy as well. The growth of the national security state, the culture of secrecy, the expansion of executive power, All were justified by the exigencies of the Cold War and later by the War on Terror and the War on Drugs. But they remained even as those threats diminished or changed, becoming permanent features of American governance. The ease with which presidents could order military action abroad, often without congressional approval or even knowledge, represented a fundamental shift in the constitutional balance of power. The CIA, created to gather intelligence, became an instrument of covert action, capable of overthrowing governments, assassinating leaders, conducting paramilitary operations, all in secret. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address grew into a vast network of bases, contractors, lobbyists, and think tanks with a vested interest in continued intervention. The defense budget, even in peacetime, remained at levels that would have been unthinkable before World War II. Perhaps most troubling was the moral cost. A nation founded on principles of liberty and self-determination became known for overthrowing governments and supporting dictators. The cognitive dissonance required to reconcile American ideals with American actions bred cynicism at home and contempt abroad. How could the United States preach democracy while backing Pinochet? How could it champion human rights while training death squads? How could it claim to support self-determination while repeatedly subverting it when it led to outcomes Washington disliked? The contradictions were stark, and they corroded the moral authority that America once claimed. When American leaders spoke of values, the words rang hollow to those who had experienced American power. The gap between rhetoric and reality was too wide to ignore, too consistent to dismiss as anomalous. It became part of America's identity in the world, a powerful nation capable of great good, but also of great harm, whose actions often contradicted its stated principles. The Venezuelan operation, uncertain futures and familiar patterns. It is still early to assess the full consequences of the Trump administration's intervention in Venezuela. As this script is being written in the weeks following Maduro's capture, the situation remains fluid, the outcome uncertain. An interim government has been installed, backed by the United States and some Latin American countries, but opposed by others. Oil production, which had collapsed under Maduro, is beginning to recover as American companies negotiate new contracts. The Russian and Chinese presence, which Trump had cited as a security threat, is being dismantled or reduced. But beneath these immediate changes, deeper problems remain. The Venezuelan military, sidelined and humiliated by the American intervention, seethes with resentment. Officers who had supported Maduro or who simply resent foreign occupation plot in secret. Pro-Maduro factions driven underground have vowed resistance. Some have fled to Colombia or Brazil, where they organize in exile, much as the Contras once organized in Honduras against Nicaragua. The Venezuelan economy is in ruins, not just from years of mismanagement under Maduro, but from decades of overdependence on oil, from corruption, from sanctions. Rebuilding will take years, perhaps decades, and will require resources and commitment that previous interventions suggest may not be forthcoming once American attention moves elsewhere. Venezuelan society is deeply divided. Chavismo, the movement founded by Hugo Chavez and continued by Maduro, had millions of supporters, mostly among the poor who had benefited from social programs even as the economy collapsed. These people did not simply disappear because Maduro was removed. They remain angry, dispossessed, feeling betrayed by the elites who have returned to power with American backing. History suggests that this anger will find expression, possibly violent expression, in the years to come. Neighboring countries watch nervously, wondering if they might be next. Brazil's President Lula has condemned the intervention forcefully, warning that it sets a dangerous precedent. Mexico's President Sheinbaum has recalled her ambassador for consultations. Colombia, under President Petro, faces Trump's threats for its criticism. The Regional Organization of American States is paralyzed, unable to reach consensus on how to respond. And within Venezuela itself, the euphoria of Maduro's removal, real as it was among his opponents, is already giving way to harder questions. Who will govern the country? How will the deep divisions within Venezuelan society be healed? How will corruption be addressed, institutions rebuilt, trust restored? Will the United States, having intervened, now commit to the long, difficult work of helping Venezuela rebuild? Or will it, as in so many past interventions, declare victory and move on, leaving Venezuelans to cope with the aftermath? History suggests the latter is more likely. American attention spans are short, American commitments conditional. When the cameras move on, when the headlines fade, when the next crisis emerges to dominate news cycles, Venezuela will likely be left largely to its own devices. The hard work of building institutions, healing societies, creating functioning economies, that work is less glamorous than military operations, requires patience and sustained commitment, and rarely generates the kind of political rewards that justify continued investment. And already, Trump is hinting at further actions, at a broader campaign to assert American dominance in the hemisphere. Colombia faces threats of tariffs and military pressure for its criticism of the Venezuela operation. Cuba, always a target of American hostility, sees its economy strangled by renewed sanctions. Its government warned that it could be next. Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega, himself a product of decades of American intervention, prepares for the possibility that his turn may come. The Monroe Doctrine, it seems, is not a one-time assertion, but a promise of more to come. The Western Hemisphere, in Trump's vision, is not a community of sovereign nations, but an American sphere of influence, to be managed, controlled, and when necessary, intervened in. The pattern continues, the justifications adapt, but the underlying dynamic remains unchanged. Lessons unlearned. Why the cycle continues. If there is a tragedy in this long history, it is not just the suffering inflicted, though that is tragedy enough, but the lessons ignored, the patterns repeated, the mistakes made again and again despite clear evidence of their costs and their failures. Why, after a century of interventions that rarely achieved their objectives and often created worse problems than they solved, does the pattern continue? Why have the lessons not been learned? Part of the answer lies in the structure of American politics and foreign policy making. Those who pay the price for failed interventions, the people of the countries intervened in, have no voice in American policy debates, no representation in Congress, no ability to hold American officials accountable. Their suffering, while real and documented, remains abstract to most Americans, distant, happening to people we don't know in places we've never been. Those who make the decisions about intervention, meanwhile, rarely face personal consequences for failure. The architects of the Guatemala coup, the designers of the Contra War, the planners of the Iraq invasion, most lived comfortable lives, wrote memoirs that justified their actions, gave speeches at prestigious institutions, retired with pensions and honors. Accountability was rare and often came too late to matter. Some faced congressional hearings or legal proceedings, but convictions were rare and often overturned. Oliver North, convicted for his role in Iran-Contra, had his conviction overturned on a technicality and later became a right-wing media personality. Henry Kissinger, whose role in Chile and Cambodia remains controversial, was never prosecuted and died at age 100, revered by many in the foreign policy establishment. The system provided little incentive to question interventionist policies or to learn from past failures. Another part of the answer lies in American exceptionalism, the deep-seated belief that the United States is fundamentally different from other nations, that its motives are pure even when its methods are violent, that its actions, unlike those of other powers, are guided by principles rather than mere interests. This belief made it difficult to see American actions through the eyes of those on the receiving end, to understand how intervention looked from the perspective of the intervened. What appeared to Washington as liberation often looked like occupation to those experiencing it. What seemed like benevolent intervention to American policymakers felt like imperial domination to Latin Americans and Asians. What was justified as protecting freedom looked suspiciously like protecting profits. The inability or unwillingness to understand these different perspectives made it difficult to learn from intervention's failures, because the failures were often attributed to local factors, corruption, backwardness, ingratitude, rather than to flaws in the interventions themselves. American exceptionalism also manifested in the belief that this time would be different, that the lessons of past interventions applied to others but not to us, that our intervention would succeed where others had failed. Each generation of policymakers believed they had learned from their predecessors' mistakes, that they would avoid the pitfalls, that they had the knowledge, the resources, the moral clarity to make intervention work. But the same patterns repeated, the same assumptions that local populations would welcome American intervention, the same underestimation of nationalist sentiment and the appeal of leaders who, whatever their flaws, were at least indigenous rather than foreign. The same faith that military force could solve political problems. The same failure to commit the resources necessary for long-term success. The same tendency to declare victory and move on before the hard work of reconstruction and reconciliation could be completed. And finally, there was the simple momentum of power, the institutional imperatives of a vast national security apparatus built during the Cold War and never fully dismantled. The CIA, created to gather intelligence, had developed extensive capabilities for covert action. The military had bases around the world, relationships with foreign militaries, plans for various contingencies. Defense contractors had products to sell and profits to make. Think tanks had experts whose expertise was intervention. Careers were built on foreign policy activism, on demonstrating toughness, on showing that America would act decisively to protect its interests. These institutions did not disappear when the Cold War ended. They sought new missions, new justifications for their existence. And they found them in the war on drugs, in the war on terror, in concerns about Chinese influence, in humanitarian intervention, in the Monroe Doctrine. Power, once accumulated, is rarely voluntarily relinquished. Institutions, once established, develop their own interests, their own momentum, their own reasons for continuing to exist and expand. The result was a foreign policy establishment with a strong bias toward action, toward intervention, toward the use of American power. Caution was often interpreted as weakness. Restraint was seen as abdication of responsibility. Non-intervention meant allowing problems to fester, threats to grow, adversaries to strengthen. The bias was always toward doing something, even when the historical record suggested that doing nothing might lead to better outcomes. The human stories behind the statistics. Behind every statistic, every death toll, every displaced population, every country destabilized, there were individual human beings, each with their own story, their own dreams, their own families, their own right to life and dignity. These are the faces too rarely seen in discussions of foreign policy, the voices too seldom heard in debates about intervention, the lives that get reduced to numbers in reports, or ignored entirely in discussions focused on strategic interests and geopolitical considerations. There was Maria, a Guatemalan indigenous woman who watched soldiers burn her village in 1982, killing her husband and 3 of her children because the military suspected the village of supporting guerrillas. She survived by hiding in the forest for weeks, eventually fleeing to Mexico, where she lived in a refugee camp for years before finally receiving asylum in Canada. She never saw Guatemala again. There was Roberto, a Chilean student activist who was arrested in 1973, days after the Pinochet coup, and taken to the National Stadium in Santiago. He was tortured for weeks, beaten, subjected to electric shocks, forced to watch others tortured and killed. He survived, was eventually released, and fled to Sweden. He lives there still, but the nightmares never stopped, and he can't hear certain sounds without being transported back to that stadium. There was Nguyen, a Vietnamese child who lost both parents and 3 siblings when American bombs destroyed her village in 1968. She was badly burned by napalm, spent months in hospitals, was left with scars across her back and arms that she carries to this day. She survived, immigrated to the United States years later, built a life. But the physical and psychological scars remain, a permanent reminder of a war that was not of her choosing. There was Juan, a Salvadoran teacher who spoke out against the military government's human rights abuses in the early 1980s. One night, men came to his house, dragged him outside, and shot him in front of his wife and children. His name appeared on a list the CIA had provided to the Salvadoran military, identifying suspected leftists. His children grew up without a father. His wife never remarried. The trauma echoing through the family for generations. There was Siti, an Indonesian woman whose husband was taken away in 1965, accused of being a communist. He was a teacher, a member of a union, but not politically active. He was never seen again. For years she searched, asking at military headquarters, at police stations, at mass graves being excavated. She never found his body, never learned exactly what happened to him. She died without knowing, without closure, without justice. These were not abstractions. They were not collateral damage, though that cold phrase was often used to describe civilian casualties. They were human beings with as much right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as any American. They had hopes for their futures, love for their families, dreams for their children. But they were born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and their nations became theaters in conflicts not of their choosing, battlegrounds in wars that served interests that were not their own. And there were American victims too, though far fewer. The soldiers sent to fight in Vietnam, many of them drafted, who returned home broken by what they had seen and done. Young men who had gone to war believing they were defending freedom and came back questioning everything, haunted by memories of villages burned, of children killed, of an enemy that seemed endless, and a purpose that seemed increasingly unclear. The CIA operatives who carried out covert operations, some of them later haunted by the consequences of their actions. Men and women who had believed they were serving their country, protecting freedom, stopping totalitarianism, only to realize years later that the people they had helped overthrow were not monsters, that the governments they had helped install were often worse, that the justifications they had been given were sometimes lies or, at best, half-truths. The families who lost loved ones in foreign lands, fighting for objectives that were never clearly defined, in wars that ended in stalemate or defeat. Parents who received folded flags and medals but never got their children back. Brothers and sisters who grew up with a void that could never be filled, a seat at the table that remained forever empty. War creates victims on all sides, suffering that ripples outward in circles, touching lives far from the battlefield, echoing through generations. But in the interventions we've discussed, the distribution of suffering was profoundly unequal. The United States waged wars far from its own shores, with its own territory never threatened, its own cities never bombed, its own civilians never displaced by the millions. The asymmetry was total, and it made it easier for Americans to ignore the costs of their country's actions, to abstract the suffering, to see it as unfortunate but necessary, collateral damage in pursuit of important objectives. But for those who bore the costs, there was nothing abstract about it. The pain was immediate, personal, enduring, and the objectives that supposedly justified their suffering, stopping communism, fighting drugs, promoting democracy, protecting American interests, often seemed distant, irrelevant, or worse, like cynical covers for actions driven by very different motives. Conclusion: the weight of history and the path not taken. As we come to the end of this long journey through more than a century of intervention, what can we conclude? The history is complex, the motives mixed, the consequences profound and lasting. There were moments when American actions may have prevented greater evils, times when intervention might have been the least bad option among poor choices. But far more often, the interventions produced suffering, instability, and resentment that lasted for generations, creating more problems than they solved, leaving scars that have not healed. The pattern that emerges is not one of heroes and villains, though there were plenty of both. It is a pattern of power used thoughtlessly, of military force applied to problems that could not be solved by force, of short-term thinking that ignored long-term consequences. It is a pattern of democracy preached but not practiced, of principles proclaimed but not honored, of a nation struggling to reconcile its ideals with its actions, and too often failing to even try. Donald Trump's invocation of the Monroe Doctrine, his declaration of the Monroe Doctrine, places him firmly within this tradition. His actions in Venezuela were not an aberration, but a continuation, perhaps a culmination. They represented a return to a more overt form of intervention, shorn of the humanitarian rhetoric that had accompanied some past interventions, but no less willing to use force to achieve American objectives. If anything, Trump's approach was more honest in its embrace of power, less constrained by concerns about international opinion or legal niceties. Whether this approach will succeed where so many past interventions failed remains to be seen, Venezuela in 2026 faces challenges that no military operation can solve. An economy in ruins, institutions weakened by years of corruption and authoritarianism, a population divided and traumatized, neighbors suspicious and resentful. The United States can remove a leader, but it cannot, through force alone, create a functioning democracy or a prosperous society. History has demonstrated this truth repeatedly, but the lesson seems never to be learned. The people of Venezuela, like the people of Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, Vietnam, and so many other nations touched by American intervention, will have to find their own path forward. The United States can help or hinder that process, but it cannot control it. History has shown, time and again, that imposed solutions rarely endure, that nations forced to accept foreign dominance inevitably seek to break free, that authentic change must come from within, not from outside, no matter how well-intentioned the outsiders claim to be. The Monroe Doctrine, like the Monroe Doctrine before it, is built on the assumption that the Western Hemisphere is America's to manage, that the nations to the south exist within an American sphere of influence, that sovereignty is conditional on alignment with American interests. But the people of those nations have never fully accepted that premise. They have resisted, rebelled, found ways to assert their autonomy despite overwhelming American power. They have paid terrible prices for that resistance: death, displacement, economic devastation, decades of lost development. But they have persisted. In the end, the question is not whether the United States has the power to intervene. Clearly, it does. The military might, the economic leverage, the technological superiority, all are undeniable. The question is whether it should, and at what cost. The history we've traced tonight suggests that the costs have been far higher than the benefits, that the interventions have created more problems than they solved, that the pursuit of hegemony in the Americas has undermined the very security and prosperity it was meant to protect. But history does not determine the future. Patterns can be broken, lessons can be learned, new paths can be chosen. Whether the United States will choose a different path, one based on genuine partnership rather than domination, on respect for sovereignty rather than intervention, on patient diplomacy rather than military force, that remains to be seen. The choice is still available, still possible, even if the momentum of history and the weight of established interests make it difficult. What would a different path look like? It would begin with humility, with an acknowledgement that past interventions have often failed, that American understanding of other societies is limited, that the best intentions can lead to terrible outcomes. It would involve listening more and dictating less, learning from others rather than always assuming we have the answers, respecting decisions made by other peoples even when we disagree with those decisions. It would mean addressing the root causes of the problems that drive intervention: poverty, inequality, corruption, weak institutions, through sustained engagement and genuine partnership, rather than through the quick fix of military action. It would mean accepting that change is slow, that development cannot be imposed from outside, that democracy must be grown, not implanted, and that the process is messy, uncertain, and requires patience. It would mean holding ourselves to the standards we claim to uphold, actually supporting democracy rather than just paying it lip service, defending human rights consistently rather than selectively, respecting sovereignty except in the most extreme circumstances. It would mean rebuilding the trust that decades of intervention have eroded, demonstrating through actions rather than words that American intentions can be trusted. Is such a path possible? The obstacles are formidable. The institutions and interests that support intervention are powerful and entrenched. The American political culture often rewards toughness and decisiveness over patience and restraint. The history of intervention has created enemies and grievances that make genuine partnership difficult. The problems that intervention seeks to address, instability, violence, drug trafficking, authoritarian regimes, are real, even if intervention is not the answer. But the alternative is to continue the pattern, to repeat the mistakes, to inflict more suffering, to create more enemies, to further erode America's moral authority and reputation. It is to remain trapped in cycles of intervention and resentment, of action and reaction, of short-term tactical successes and long-term strategic failures. It is to continue claiming to support values while acting in ways that contradict them, breeding cynicism both at home and abroad. The choice, ultimately, is ours. We can continue on the path we've traveled for more than a century, the path of intervention and dominance, of asserting our power and our interests regardless of the consequences for others. Or we can choose a different path, harder perhaps, less immediately satisfying, but ultimately more consistent with our stated values and more likely to create a world in which all nations, not just the powerful, can prosper. For tonight, though, our journey ends here. The story of American intervention, from Monroe to Trump, from Guatemala to Venezuela, from the Philippines to Vietnam, is a story of power and its consequences, of good intentions leading to bad outcomes, of a nation struggling to reconcile its ideals with its actions. It is a story that continues to unfold, and one that will shape not just the hemisphere, but the entire international order for years to come. Sleep well, and remember that behind every policy, every intervention, every statistic, there are human beings, trying to live their lives, raise their families, build their futures. Their stories matter, their voices deserve to be heard, and their suffering should never be dismissed as merely the cost of doing business in a competitive world. They are not abstractions or collateral damage. They are us if we have been born in different places, under different flags, on the other side of the power that shapes the world. Good night.